The symbol of the Duchy of Cartier? A huge snake, a mythical creature 4 meters long. The founder of the Cartier family tree was a child born from the union of a snake and a man, and it was said that the Duke's men went crazy for money and power. It was all because of their serpentine nature, as well as their strong, simply gigantic desire for snakes. This desire made me swallow everything in the world. The young man was puzzled. He did not understand how he had come to this. He looked at his victim intently and predatorily. He asked with a grin if she was scared now. He pulled himself closer to her and said that she should have done enough. The girl moved away from him a little. He looked at her and said with a smirk that she should do it louder, so that the people behind the wall could hear her screams. The young man tenderly kissed every inch of her body. The young lady, in turn, trembled with fear. She was a little nervous because she knew this had never happened in the past. The young lady just wanted to survive, with the help of the dangerous Mountain King. She just wanted to become the devil's false lover. She really wanted to get rid of the terrible future that awaited her. She wanted to save herself from a future cursed by civil strife in the duchy, a future in which she would be killed and thrown to the worms. She looked intently at the young man, so she knew that she shouldn't have any problems. She always froze in fear when she saw the young man. She understood perfectly well that he was the most famous maniac in the empire. For this reason, she knew that she had to either let it break her or stand up and do something to protect her future. Her father abandoned her and her mother almost immediately after her birth, and since then she was raised in a monastery. Her mother died of illness, and she was left alone. Reflecting on this, she realized that she had lived a worthy life, until Duke Cartier, from the family of greedy snakes, came to them. He absorbed everything in his path. He won the war. Nothing could stop him on his way. They destroyed everything in their path. People whispered and pitied her on the spinning top of the lady who was in the monastery. The young man casually pushed the young lady and she fell to the ground with a crash. The man looked at her with a smirk. Someone cried out that now in front of her was Sir Jacob, the heir of the Cartier family. He said with a grin that she was the last blood of the Laure family, the last countess. He threw her a document and told her to sign it. He said that her father had to pay him reparations. She froze when she saw how much she had to pay him back. With tears in her eyes, she said that she did not have that much money. He said with a grin that she could give him some as collateral. Jacob said with a grin that she would be the collateral. He said that she had a lot of land, and also that when she worked for him, she would be able to pay off the debt. Jacob looked at her with lust and said that such a beauty could be useful to him. The young lady froze in shock. She realized that she had no way out. He looked at her intently and said with a grin that today she was the property of his family. After the sham inheritance ceremony, all the little she had collapsed into the abyss. After 11 years of living in the estate, she decided to run away. The young lady hated them and wanted to run away. Jacob screamed furiously and called for Alicia, but it was all in vain. The young lady was very scared. She didn't want to die at all. She just couldn't bear the whole nightmare of her life. The young lady stumbled and fell to the ground with a crash. Jacob looked at her with fury and contempt and asked if she really thought she could escape. He shouted that as long as the seal was on her body, he would be able to easily find her even in the most remote corner of the duchy. He pulled her hair and said that if she wrote a suicide note and died, it would all end. She screamed angrily at him to let go, and a moment later, she hit him in the face with all her might. Jacob, in turn, screamed in rage and pushed her away. He did not understand how she dared to hurt her master. A moment later, the young lady fell to the ground with a crash, and in doing so, she hit a rock. Everyone was very worried because they saw that the girl was lying quietly on the ground. They did not understand how to hush it all up. The young lady woke up and screamed. The maid looked at her in surprise and asked if she had really woken up. Alicia looked at the young woman and the servant girl with concern and asked where she was. The girl told the young lady that she had fainted in front of the temple. Alicia thought for a moment, as she knew that she had indeed fallen in front of the temple a few years ago when she was going to pray on New Year's Eve. She looked intently into the mirror and for a moment froze in surprise. She stared at her reflection as she realized that the scar was not on her face. She slowly got out of bed. With lightning speed, the young lady went to the window and watched everything intently. She saw people running hurriedly down the street, each busy with their own business. She understood that there would soon be some kind of event, since everyone was running around in a hurry. The young lady sighed heavily as she realized that the truth had returned to the past. She clenched her fists in anger and began to cry. She understood that her miserable future would repeat itself again. Meanwhile, the young man was slowly riding in the carriage. He was returning home. The girl looked at Alicia and asked with a smile if she was feeling better. Alicia was taken aback, as she did not expect anyone to call her. Alicia said she was fine. The girl smiled and said it was very good, as she was afraid that her friend would miss the owner's birthday. She kept telling her about all the preparations and also asked if she would go. Alicia sighed heavily and told her friend not to get her hopes up for the party since they wouldn't be able to get any closer. She said that if they didn't finish their work on time, they would definitely be beaten for being distracted. The girl said that there would be a lot of nobility there, and they could meet someone, thereby they could pay off their debt. She knew that the knights and families were rewarded for their valor and courage. She said with a smile, but the knight did not even look at the mountains of money and the beautiful smiles of the noble ladies. He gave his heart to one of the maids who did the laundry, and thus helped her pay off all her debts. She smiled and said that after that, they lived happily ever after. She said with a radiant smile that it was very romantic. Alicia sighed heavily and said that this was just nonsense. The young lady was shocked because her friend was very cold. Alicia in turn knew that they would never release the prey that had been so easily caught in the net. Alicia looked at Lodi intently, as she knew her future very well. She will understand the cruelty of life when she seduces Jacob to escape from hell, after which she will become his pet. Then she asked Alicia to pretend that they didn't know each other, since she felt awkward about it. But a few months after their affair, she will be thrown to the wild wolves on the orders of Jacob's wife? She sighed heavily because she knew that if she told her friend about this, she would not believe her. She knew there was no point in it, since the future was predetermined anyway. Now she looked intently at her friend, who was glowing with happiness and childish naivety. She understood perfectly well that her terrible death was no exception, and that it was simply inevitable. Sometime later, they were leisurely returning to their estate after a long day of washing. Lodi was talking with a smile to her friend. The young lady, in turn, was immersed in her thoughts. She did not want to live the same life at all. Alicia knew that if she was destined to die anyway, she had to try to change her future. She was puzzled and did not understand how to do this. Suddenly, she heard her friend's delighted cry. The young lady looked up and noticed a carriage rushing towards them. Lottie was very surprised, because in front of them now was the general's carriage. She cried out in alarm that everyone was gathering for the holiday. She approached her friend and called her. She looked at her in surprise, as her friend was all wet. Alicia, in turn, froze in place. A moment later, Lodi saw Carol's carriage. Alicia shuddered at the mention of this name. With tears in her eyes, she looked into the distance. With lightning speed, she pulled her friend away and covered her with her body. A moment later, a young lady appeared before them in all her glory. Alicia knew very well that Carol, Jacob's wife, was beautiful and graceful, but rotten inside. Carol looked at the maid with mockery and contempt and asked if she had seduced her husband. The young lady was shocked. She didn't understand what Carol was talking about. Alicia understood perfectly well that she was the woman who would disfigure her face in the future. Carol quickly ran up to the carriage. She greeted the general with a smile. Lodi understood that she intended to direct the carriage towards the general. A moment later, the young man got out of the carriage and, looking at the girl, asked if she could move away from his carriage. The young maids looked at them intently from the side. They knew that he had quarreled with the lady as soon as she stopped the carriage. The young lady, in turn, looked at them intently, as she knew that in the past, he had immediately left when the head of the house called him. She looked at them intently with tears in her eyes, because she knew that all this had happened in a past life. Carol smiled and said that she could not even imagine meeting the general like this. She said that it was destiny. He looked at her intently and asked how she could call a deliberate accident fate. The young lady was taken aback. She looked at him intently and said with a sly smile that it was all because of the coachman, and she too was surprised when the carriage suddenly stopped. She looked at him intently for a while and spoke, but the general did not pay attention to her words. A moment later, he turned his attention to the young maids who were standing not far from them. Alicia looked at the general intently and shuddered. Lucerne in turn told the maids to leave. She was surprised, since last time there was nothing like that, except for a small meeting between the general and the lady. She walked closer to him and froze in place. The young lady wondered if her future had changed. The young lady was confused. She didn't know what exactly had happened, but she knew she had no choice, and she had to face it head on. He looked at her intently and asked if this wasn't Jacob's territory. She didn't answer him and continued to cry quietly. She stood covered in dirt. The general looked at Carol intently and asked who the girls were. She was taken aback and said that they were the maids of their house. She said that they were the daughters of selfish people. devoid of any ability. She looked sideways at the girls and said that their parents, the debtors, had given them up as collateral. Carol said she just felt sorry for the girls and they were allowed to do simple errands. He looked closely at the young maid and said that she would turn out to be quite touchy. He was a little surprised and, looking at the girl, asked why she was crying. Carol was shocked and did not understand why the general was paying attention to some servant when she was nearby. She looked at the girl with fury and asked how she dared to appear like that in front of the guest. She shouted at the maid that she might have misled him into thinking that they were treating her badly. She shouted at the maid to quickly apologize to the general. The young lady looked at them intently and asked if she should take off her clothes. The general was taken aback by her words. He did not expect to hear such a thing. She looked at them and said that she was in that condition because of the mud that had splashed up from under the wheels of Carol's carriage, and she did not think that it was her fault. She sighed heavily and said that it was definitely not her fault, and if her appearance made them uncomfortable, she would simply take off her clothes. The young lady was furious. She did not understand what the maid was saying. Lottie ran up to her friend. She was in shock, as she did not expect to hear something like this from her. At the same time, the general looked at her with a smirk. Carol sighed heavily and pretended to say that all her maids knew how to do was make excuses. She shouted that this was simply beyond all bounds. She was in shock. She didn't understand what they were doing in front of the general. She moved closer to the general in pretense. The young lady glanced briefly at the general. She froze in shock as he did not look at her. The young lady was simply shocked as the general ran to the maid. He came closer to the maid and looked at her intently. He asked the young maid in bewilderment why she was crying. Alicia timidly apologized for keeping him waiting. She said she was just sad that the freshly washed clothes were now dirty. He looked at her intently and said that the responsibility for this incident was somehow his, and for this reason he would compensate her. He slowly took off his cloak and threw it over the young lady. She froze in surprise. He looked at her and told her to cover herself with his cloak. He came closer to her and quietly whispered in her ear that she should not pay attention to those around her, especially those who lived in the estate. Some time later, the young lady sat quietly and looked at the cloak. She knew that the day had been full of surprises, and she had not expected to run into that man. Now she could still feel his gaze on her. That gaze pierced her right through. She knew that the general was a black snake. Lucerne had bright red eyes that looked straight into the soul. Along with the eyes, he inherited the special skill of the craftsman. However, because his mother was of lower class, he was unable to take the surname Cartier. Even the always cool-headed head of the family was disappointed by this. The problem was not at all a shortage of heirs, since in their family, the head of the family was chosen through fair competition. The general's abilities as an illegitimate orphan, superior to all others, seemed frightening. He was 25 years old, and at this age, he was already a knight with the rank of general and commanded all the military personnel of the empire. He achieved everything on his own, but in her past life, he was never able to become an official member of the family. In a past life, he told a young lady that when he was little, he made a vow to himself. He said that anything he couldn't take for himself, he would destroy. The young lady understood perfectly well that he was very dangerous. Lottie looked at her in surprise and asked why she wasn't sleeping. Alicia winced as she was lost in her thoughts. Lottie yawned and said that she was very tired and wanted to sleep already. The young lady, in turn, understood perfectly well that she had returned in time, but her duty had not gone away. She knew that even if she escaped, she would still be caught because of her slave mark. But in turn, she knew one family secret very well, so she had no choice. She knew that she had to take advantage of her chance. She understood perfectly well that there was one specific person who could pay the entire amount of her debt out of his pocket. She knew that she needed to urgently find the general and come to an agreement with him. At the same time, the general was leisurely taking a bath. The young lady, in turn, walked slowly towards the general. She had heard earlier in which room he always stayed. There was a secret in the mansion that only she knew. She clearly knew the entire system of hidden passages that connected all the buildings and rooms of the estate. The young lady, in turn, understood perfectly well that as long as Jacob was alive and in power, she would not be able to escape, and she was very afraid. At the same time, the general was taking a bath. He sighed heavily, since he did not like returning home at all. The butler looked at him intently and said that the daughters of disgraced aristocrats who would soon inherit the title wanted to meet him today. He told the general that if he liked any girl, he could choose her and marry her. The general was very surprised and puzzled, as he understood that they still could not control their temper and were forcing him to enter into marriage. He sighed heavily and said that, for Togo to have the right to own the land, it was enough to be a knight, and therefore he asked for the girls to be returned back. He didn't understand why they kept testing him. He had no desire to have a family and all that it entailed. He looked intently at everyone present and quickly rose to his feet. The general asked the girls if they wanted him to find a good reason to refuse each of them. He looked at them with fury and said that the butler would take care of it. He sighed heavily. He thought that he could return the empires, the lands he had once conquered. The general, in turn, understood perfectly well that the head of the family was still the same greedy man as before. The general was taken aback for a moment, as he did not understand why he remembered that maid. He was furious because he was going crazy. He didn't understand why he was thinking about that woman. He knew that she would be destroyed by his family. He remembered how they told him that he was just a bastard, deprived of the right to desire anything. They told him that he was just a sin and the threshold of his family. The man said that before the seeds of his sinful desire sprouted, he would try to correct it with a whip. For this reason, he beat the boy every day. He sighed heavily, as he understood that his grandfather wanted to test his strength tomorrow afternoon. He knew that he had to return immediately after breakfast. The general was a little puzzled and galled, as he was not left alone, even here. The young lady looked around in bewilderment as she heard some noise. A moment later, a strong wind blew and her candle went out. Unfortunately, she couldn't see anything. She froze for a moment as she heard some strange sound. A moment later, she realized that she had torn her nightgown to shreds. She sighed heavily, as she knew that it was just clothing and she needed to pull herself together. The young lady understood perfectly well what she had come all this way, and now she could not retreat because of such a trifle. A moment later, she crept quietly into the room. A moment later, she suddenly froze in place as she saw the general and the man lying on the ground. The general looked at the young lady in surprise and asked angrily on whose order she had entered the room. He looked at her with a cold, furious gaze and asked who exactly had sent her. The young lady, in turn, was taken aback and shouted that this was not so. She was trembling and did not know what to do as she was incredibly scared. She looked at him intently and said that she would like to make a deal with them because she had information. She shouted that he would not lose and would definitely become the leader. The general thought for a moment and laughed hysterically. He looked at her intently and asked if he should trust her. He looked at the young maid with a wicked grin and said that she was wearing a very elegant outfit. He sighed heavily and said that she was the worst spy he had ever encountered, and that made it even funnier. He looked at her with a satisfied grin and said that he was not in the mood now. He used his power on her and asked if she would answer him now. He looked at her with fury and asked who to send her friend to. She screamed that she was on his side, and no one sent her. A moment later, she said a few words to him, and he froze in place in shock. Alicia looked at him intently and continued speaking. He furiously attacked the young maid and began to strangle her. The general looked at her with fury and asked who she was. Jacob looked at his wife and said that, with the help of this secret, Lucerne could become the head. With tears in his eyes, he looked at her and said that no one should ever know about this. He sighed heavily and said that no one should know about this, at least until he felt in control. She looked at him intently and with a sly smile called him to her. The young lady smiled and said that she had already burned this information. She said with a satisfied smile that now no one would ever know the truth. The young lady was taken aback by what she heard. Trembling, she asked the general if he didn't want to know how his mother really died. He looked at the young lady with fury but did not answer. A moment later, he grabbed her hand and dragged her toward the bed. She was in shock and screamed at him to wait, but a moment later the general ordered his shadow to hold the young servant. Alicia froze in place as she realized that this was magic that only the general possessed. It scared her very much. He looked at the young servant with fury and told her to report everything to him immediately. He looked at her in surprise and asked if there was a secret passage in this mansion, and she went through it. The young lady, trembling with fear, said that everything was exactly like that, and she had discovered all the passages by accident. She sighed heavily and said that all this time she had been living as a ghost and collecting valuable information. Alicia said Jacob was not careful and did not keep track of his paperwork. He looked at the young lady with a grin and, breathing heavily, said that he didn't even know how much information he would need. He looked at her intently. She understood that she would have to tell him something valuable and important so that he would not kill her. She looked at him intently and said that she knew he wanted to take the throne. She looked at him intently and said that it was impossible, and that was why he had decided to destroy Cartier. She said she knew he wanted to wipe out what he couldn't have. Moments later, the young man approached her with lightning speed and she froze in place. He looked at her with fury and said that she apparently wanted to die. Alicia looked at him intently and cried out that she wanted to help him take the throne. He looked at her in surprise as he had not expected anything like this at all, but a moment later he burst into hysterical laughter. He sighed heavily and said that he could admit that there was one way to achieve this. He looked at her intently and asked what she wanted in return for this. She sighed heavily and said that he should pay off her debt. He looked at her in surprise and asked how much she owed. Alicia said that her debt was 30,000 gold. He was surprised and asked what had to be done to get into such debt. She sighed heavily and said that it was reparation, because she was the daughter of a nobleman count from a conquered kingdom. Alicia looked at him intently and said with a heavy sigh that at least that's what she was told. He looked at her hard and said that this was all very inaccurate. Lucerne looked at her and asked how he could trust her. Lady froze for a moment. He sighed heavily and asked angrily if she really thought she was the only one who tried to get out of this with the story about his mother. She looked at him intently because she knew that this would not be easy. She did not expect him to be interested in her story. But a moment later, she felt a hellish burning sensation on her neck. She understood that Jacob was looking for her. Jacob was furious because he realized that the general was interested in the young servant. He shouted that he should try her first and then throw her out. He looked at the knights with fury and shouted for them to call the magician immediately. He wanted her to be found immediately. A moment later, there was a knock on the general's door, and he was told that a runaway girl was hiding in his room. At the same time, the young lady was writhing in pain. The knights told the general that it might not be safe and they should search the room. The general looked sideways at the girl and said that they had already come for her. She was in shock and wondered if this was really how it would end for her. She quickly approached the general and said that he could make her his servant and she would do anything for him. The young lady was in shock. She screamed that she simply could not believe that everything was going against her. She looked at him intently and shouted that she would do anything. But the general did not answer her. A moment later, she screamed furiously. She didn't understand what the point of being a countess was if she couldn't do anything. She screamed furiously that she couldn't even pay off her debts. He froze in surprise, looking at the lady. The general slowly approached her and asked if she really had a title. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand why his face had suddenly changed. He looked closely at the young lady and, breathing heavily, said that he realized that she had inherited the title of Earl. Lucerne looked at the young lady with a smirk and said that they would have to open the door. With lightning speed, he pulled the young lady closer to him. She was taken aback and looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand what he was doing. He looked at her intently and told her to be quiet. The general looked intently at the lady and said that from that moment on, she would officially be his wife. He quietly moved closer to her and said that for this reason, she should scream so that everyone could hear her. The young lady pushed him away and asked him to stop, as she could not take it anymore. He looked at her with fury and told her that she didn't want to go back to Jacob, and he already knew that. The young lady looked at him intently, as she realized that she simply had no choice. A moment later, with tears in her eyes, she asked him to help her. The young man looked at the lady with a grin and said that he would do everything. At the same time, Jacob was furious. He did not understand how the general dared to humiliate him. He was furious and knew that this time he would not let the good deed go unpunished. Lucerne sighed heavily and said that everyone had already left and they could continue the conversation. She understood perfectly well that no one would dare to enter the room. They understood perfectly well that the general and the girl were in the room. He looked at her intently and said that she should tell him more about the information she had about his mother. She looked at him intently and said that this time she would not tell him anything. He looked at her in surprise, but she sighed and said that she couldn't tell him everything until he guaranteed her safety. She said that she could not survive without his protection now, and instead, she promised to provide information with hard evidence. He looked at it with a smirk and said that it looked like a scam. He asked what she wanted, and also said that he could not promise to give her everything, but she could tell him. She looked at him sharply, and said that people would gossip about him stealing something that belonged to Jacob, and for that reason she would become an object of ridicule. He looked at her intently and said that sweet words usually turn out to be poisonous. A moment later he looked at the young lady and, breathing heavily, said that he would pay her debt. She jumped up as she did not expect him to agree so quickly. He pulled her towards him and with a predatory smile said that in return, she would marry him. The young lady was taken aback, as she had not expected anything like this at all. The general looked at the lady with a predatory grin and said that she would marry him today and right now. Jacob shouted angrily at the Duke that the general had stolen his property. The young man said with a grin that this time it was too much, since the bastard had taken property from a member of the ruling family. Jacob screamed that by law he should be whipped and have his hands cut off. The general looked at them intently and calmly said that the head of the house had been asking him to marry the noblewoman for a very long time. He looked at everyone present and said that he was simply fulfilling his request. Looking at Jacob, he said that he spent the previous night with Jacob's maid. He looked at them intently and said that he had promised to marry her. Everyone looked at the young man in shock, and the Duke asked if he was really going to get married. The Duke was surprised, as he had insulted and sent home all the women he had sent him. He looked at the Duke intently and said that the women he sent him were out of reach for someone like him. Lucerne sighed heavily and said that he did not deserve them. He said that he only needed a wife for the sake of the title, and to fulfill certain duties. He looked at them and said that Jacob didn't care much about the Countess just because she owed him a lot of money. He treated her like a stray dog. He said that he saw nothing terrible in the fact that he took the jewel for himself, and for others, it was nothing more than trash. The Duke thought for a moment as he heard of the sum of money owed by the young lady. He looked at Jacob intently and asked how one woman could owe such a large sum of money. The general looked at the Duke and said that this was reparation. He said that the woman he was marrying was the Duke's daughter, Laura. The Duke was surprised that Jacob had overstated the amount of compensation for the war. He knew that he had taken away the lands, but he did not expect that he would take such a sum. Jacob looked at the Duke and called him, calling him Grandpa. The Duke then became very angry and shouted that he had told him to call him Duke. A moment later, the Duke said that Jacob should adjust the amount and bill Lucerne. Jacob began to object. He looked at them intently and said that he had no intention of bargaining for the ransom of his wife, and that he would pay the entire original amount. A moment later, he said that he was forced to deviate, as he had already received permission from the Duke and now had to prepare for the engagement. The Duke looked at the young man intently and told him to stop and wait. A moment later, the Duke said he had one condition. The young lady was slowly getting ready. A moment later, the general entered my room and froze in place. She looked at him with embarrassment, as she had not expected to see him at all. The young lady woke up and thought for a moment. She knew that her future husband was now discussing this situation at a family meeting. She knew that it would be difficult to convince Jacob, but still, his opponent was the general himself. The young lady, in turn, hoped that everything would go well. She wondered if she would be able to live freely. She looked closely at the young man and said that she knew that he needed a noblewoman for a wife, but he could marry anyone regardless of her reputation. She sighed heavily and said that he would have to pay a large sum for it. He sighed heavily and said that it seemed that she did not understand something. He looked at her intently and said with a smirk that she would definitely be his bride because she had the information he needed. Lucerne said with a grin that she herself was becoming the guarantor of the fairness of the deal. He sighed heavily and said that the more useful she was, the greater her reward, and when the time came, they could divorce. He came up behind her and told her to remember that she shouldn't lie to him or spy behind his back. She sighed heavily and said that she couldn't do it, and she understood everything. He looked at her intently and said that she must not let him down. She thought for a moment, as she felt like he was trying to take advantage of her. She knew that until everything became clear, he couldn't be trusted. A moment later, the young lady heard a knock on the door and became wary. A moment later, knights entered the room. The girl said that her name was Nora de Marat, and she served Lucerne in the Order of the Black Ryan. The young man smiled and looked at the young lady and said that his name was Ian. Ian apologized for their rudeness. He said that unfortunately they had no maids, and they needed to get her ready as soon as possible. He smiled and said that he used to work in the locker room, and Alicia in turn agreed with them. She knew that the Knights of Black Ryan were subordinate to Lucerne. The knights under his command are independent of gender and self-determination and are now known throughout the Empire. Alicia looked closely at the knight. She knew a lot about him. She knew that he was quite popular among women because of his appearance. Nora, despite her gender, was a knight of the Empire. She froze for a moment as the knight handed her a handkerchief. Nora looked at the young lady closely and said that she was bleeding, so she should accept the handkerchief. Nora had been kind to her in her past life. Nora slowly handed her the contract and said that she should check it after she finished with the makeup. The general looked at his subordinate in surprise and asked what he was doing here. He smiled and said that, unfortunately, there was no one to help the young lady with her makeup. The general looked at the young lady in surprise. A moment later, he asked Nora if the lady had signed the contract. Nora looked at the general sharply and said that the young lady had not signed it yet. Alicia sighed heavily. It was the first time she had worn such an expensive dress. She looked at the young man intently as she felt very strange. The general looked at his subordinates and said that he could handle the rest himself and that they could leave. She looked timidly in the mirror and wondered if the dress fit her properly. Lucerne pulled the young lady closer to him and looked at her with a smile. She froze for a moment, as she did not expect this. He looked at her closely and said with a satisfied smile that it was the cutest thing he had seen on her. She pushed him away in embarrassment and said that everything that had happened before was a simple accident. A moment later, he smiled as he noticed that the outfit was unbuttoned. He smiled and said that he looked forward to their future. He looked at her with a smile and said that since she was so beautiful today, they could sign a contract right away. The young lady, in turn, frowned and wondered if he was laughing at her. He looked at her sharply and said that they needed to get her sorted out with the contract quickly, as Jacob's men would be arriving in a few hours. The young lady was taken aback after reading the contract. She read that she could not ask for a divorce during the marriage. In case of divorce due to the fault of the young lady, she will have to return to him the amount for work at the time of divorce. And during the marriage, in case of irresponsibility, the young lady will be deprived of her freedom. She was shocked, wondering how anyone could give up their body under such conditions. A moment later, the young lady placed the document on the table. She sighed heavily and, looking at the general, said that she could not sign this contract. He looked at her with fury and said that if he decided that he would buy more, it would be difficult to convince him otherwise. She looked at him intently and said that she had not changed her mind about helping him. However, there was something she wanted to change in the contract. He looked at her with fury and asked why she was trying to take the initiative. He said that he didn't like negotiations at all. Alicia sighed and said that all the points of the agreement focused on what would happen if she betrayed him. She looked at him sharply and said that if he couldn't trust her, then he could use agents to interrogate her. He looked at the young lady in surprise, as she had not expected to hear anything like that. He sighed heavily and said that he didn't understand at all what kind of girl she was and what she wanted. She looked at him intently and asked forcefully when a divorce would be possible. He sighed heavily and said that he would allow the divorce when he had a successor or when the marriage was no longer necessary. She looked at him intently and said that when he became a duke, he would no longer need her. He said with a smirk that when a bastard tries to sit on the throne, people call it a rebellion. He said that he could not survive if he rebelled. She shouted angrily that she didn't care who took the throne. She looked at him intently and said that at this rate, he would not be able to protect her. He looked at her in surprise and asked if this was her only condition. She also asked him to remove the point about adultery since anyone could come up with rumors, and she would not have proof that she was right. She said that if he was going to do business under her name, it had to be legal, and she didn't want him dealing drugs or guns. He looked at her in surprise and said that she already understood this, as if she had already been burned by it once. She shuddered, but did not answer. The general looked closely at the young lady and asked if she was satisfied with the changes made. The young lady nodded and began signing the contract. He looked at her intently and told her to remember one thing, that the absence of a certain point does not make her free. He looked at her intently and asked if she understood it. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she understood everything. Lucerne looked closely at the young lady and said that they should now act like a couple. A few days later, they were dealing with her tattoo. The man looked at everyone present and asked how they would use tracking magic. The general looked at them intently and said that his shadow would feed on her. A moment later, he used his magic and the young lady winced in pain. She understood perfectly well that now he would be able to catch her, no matter where she ran. She really wanted to look at her new tattoo in the mirror. He suddenly looked at them with fury and said that if they wanted to leave the room on their own 2 feet, they should lower their eyes to the floor. With lightning speed, they began to run out of the room in a hurry. The young lady slowly walked up to the mirror and sneaked a look at her new tattoo. She sighed heavily because now she really felt it. He looked at her closely and said that everyone was interested in her. He looked at the young lady with a smile and said that in recent days everyone had been gossiping about her. He understood that she was very suspicious, and it was for this reason that the Duke insisted on the wedding. He looked closely at her tattoo and said that he would like to change it, as it was terrible. The young lady looked intently at the young man. She wondered if she had really become his bride. She felt their evil looks on her. They mocked her and said that she was just a slave. The Duke, in turn, looked at the young lady with fury. He was burning with anger. She sighed heavily and began to shake, as she was very scared. A moment later, the young man touched her tattoo and said that he had sealed it. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that she should not forget that she was now his property. Lucerne looked closely at the young lady and said that she should act like his wife. She understood perfectly well that she was no longer the same as in the past, and she had already become stronger, and now she was standing in front of people who trampled the past version of her. The young lady was excited. She did not think at all that she would be able to start a new life after her own terrible death. Moreover, she could not even imagine what would happen to the general's wife. She knew she had another chance, and she didn't want to repeat her past fate. She wanted revenge on the Cartier family. She hoped to gain the long-awaited freedom. The general slowly put the ring on the young lady's hand. He looked at her intently, and a moment later, they were informed that they were now officially married. The Duke frowned for a moment and told his grandson that he remembered how capricious he had been. The Duke looked at his grandson closely and said that although he had refused to marry, the young lady had forced him to do so. He sighed heavily and said that his wife had been successful from the very beginning. He looked at the Duke in surprise and said that she was a very interesting girl, and he, in turn, found her funny. The Duke looked at him intently and said that they would soon find out. He looked closely at the young lady and said that they would soon know if she was worth the money. The young lady looked closely at the relics of the saint, the dragon's head, and even at the paintings of famous artists. She thought for a moment, as she was surprised that these treasures were displayed in the reception hall. The young lady came closer to her and asked with a smirk why she was looking so intently. Alicia froze for a moment. The young lady said with a smirk that they had prepared all the gifts in honor of the Duke's birthday. The Duke had 3 sons. The only one surviving was the middle one, Merha. He became a priest and went into a monastery. Now he aspired to take the post of pope and become the head of the church. He gave his right of succession to his son, Marco. The father had turned his own son into an obedient puppet, and now it was natural that he would fully support him. Arian, the granddaughter of the great mentor, she helped her husband in everything. One day, they kidnapped her to threaten Jacob. The young men said with a smirk and disdain that the young lady was very resilient. Marco looked at the girl with a smirk. He was wondering if she really didn't know anything or if she was devoted to Jacob. Arian looked at the girl intently and asked with a smirk what they could possibly know about the abominations they were ordered to do. She looked closely at the young lady and said with a smirk that she didn't know if she had seen this before. Alicia sighed heavily. She understood that her vile heart, which despised people, remained the same. A moment later, she said that she saw this treasure. She looked at all the treasures with a smile and said that she didn't know if it was because it was a gift for the Duke, but there were many real rarities here. She looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that she saw the average gift of the Holy Prophet's bone. Arian looked closely at the girl, but did not answer. She knew that what lay before her now was a genuine bone fragment of a man who had died a natural death due to his protective properties. This item had caused a sensation at the auction. Arian looked closely at the girl and said that it seemed like she had her eye on the methane treasure. A moment later, she said with a satisfied smile that it was a gift to the Duke from her husband. A moment later, the young ladies turned around as they heard someone crying. Jacob was taken aback and looked closely at his wife. He was surprised and asked what happened. Carol said with tears in her eyes that she was very happy. She looked closely at her husband and said that he knew how much they cared for Alicia because they were family. She looked intently at her husband and said that she simply could not believe that their little Alicia had met such a wonderful groom. Alicia in turn watched this scene intently. Carol, with tears in her eyes, said that she was very touched and really hoped that Alicia would become a beloved bride. Alicia looked at the young lady in surprise and thanked her for the congratulations. A moment later, Carol said she thought Alicia was mistaken. She came closer to her and said that Lucerne had made the announcement at breakfast that he was getting married only because Alicia was in a miserable situation. She looked at the girl with a smirk and said that he just needed someone so as not to upset his parents. She said with a smile that he needed some ruined noblewoman without money or power. A moment later, she said with tears in her eyes that there was nothing more beautiful than love, and if she were Alicia, she would feel terrible. Arian looked at them in surprise and sighed heavily, saying that she didn't even know that there was such a story behind all this. She said that it was very sad to listen to. Alicia looked at them intently and said with a smirk that Mrs. Carroll was quite arrogant. Carol looked at the young lady in surprise. She did not expect to hear such a thing. Alicia looked at them intently and said that arrogance, they say, is one of the virtues of aristocrats. She looked at them intently and said that if there are 100 couples in the world, then there will be 100 forms of love. She looked at them intently and asked why they could not say that this was love, since her husband was attracted to her sad story. She looked at everyone present and said that it seemed like they were talking about her family. She asked with a smirk on her face, had they all forgotten how Lord died? The young people froze in shock and tensed up. The young lady, in turn, glared at them. She was burning with anger. She wanted to defend herself and thereby put them in their place. Jacob looked at the young lady with fury and asked if she was blaming his family. He looked at her angrily and asked if she really meant that they should apologize to her family. She knew he was about to strike her, and for that reason she closed her eyes. That was exactly what she wanted from him. But a moment later she opened her eyes and saw that nothing had happened. The general grabbed Jacob's hand in anger and said that he was simply shameless. Jacob screamed in pain. The general looked at Jacob with disdain and told him not to raise his voice in the Duke's presence. Jacob was in shock. He didn't understand what was happening at all. The young lady, in turn, froze in place in surprise, as her husband helped her in this situation. Carol quickly ran to her husband. She was very worried about whether he was okay or not. Jacob, in turn, angrily asked the general how he dared to touch him before his vacation. Carol quickly turned around and looked intently at the Duke. She called out to him. She told the Duke that the general was not that kind of person, and she thought he had misunderstood his wife, and a dispute had broken out in that house. She looked intently at the Duke and, trembling with fear, said that she was very scared. The young lady looked at Carol intently and called her. She looked at her with a smile and said that she thought she had better ask the head of the house for forgiveness. Carol was taken aback and looked at the young lady in surprise. She didn't understand what she was talking about. She screamed that she had done nothing wrong. She angrily pushed the young lady away and hit her on the arm. Alicia looked at her closely and said with a smirk that as the wife of the family's eldest son, she should be a role model. She said that a woman who puts her tears on display for everyone to see is not able to cope with the problem on her own and begs for help from others. She said with a smirk that such a woman was not suitable to be the eldest daughter-in-law of such a prestigious family. She looked at her closely and said that she was very weak. At the same time, a picture from a past life appeared before the young lady. She remembered the Duke's gaze. He told her that the wolf that eats sheep is innocent. He looked at her intently and said that weakness is the greatest sin. The young lady looked at Carol intently and said with a smile that she thought weakness was a great sin. She understood perfectly well that after a life lived in fear and animal terror, the Duke's favorite words came much easier to her. The Duke was surprised. He did not understand how her Nellety could know how to behave in such a situation. He was surprised, as she remained calm in such a disgusting atmosphere. He looked at the young lady intently, because he liked the way she thought. He liked her life position and values. He looked at her intently, because he realized that he needed to observe her. Carol was furious. She did not understand how the young lady dared to disgrace her in front of the Duke. Marco looked at the young lady with a predatory smile. He smiled and said that she was very sexy. He noticed that Lucenra had an eye for beauty. Ariane looked at the young lady with fury and anger. She understood that the girl was, after all, a simple slave. The Duke looked closely at everyone present and said that they were making a lot of noise, and he also asked them to come to him. The Duke looked at them closely and said that he had accepted all the gifts they had sent her. It must have been difficult for them to get them. Carol said with a smile that it had been difficult for them, but they had still managed to get hold of the wonderful 34th Fantastic series by the artist Ilump. She smiled a satisfied smile and said that her husband had tried very hard to reserve this painting. Ariane stood before the young lady with lightning speed and greeted the Duke with a smile. She looked at him closely and said with a satisfied smile that they had worked long and hard to prepare the sculpture and bones of the seer. She said with a satisfied smile that if he had the bone for a very long time, then he would live a long life. She smiled and said that also to give him strength. Her father put in a lot of effort in the lead-up to the papal election. Alicia looked at her intently, as she knew that Merha wanted to be pope. She knew that he wanted to do this for Togo, to give his son the opportunity to become a duke in this family. The young lady, in turn, knew perfectly well that the Duke did not want his son to become a father at all. Ariane looked closely at the Duke and said with a smile that his support would be very valuable. He sighed heavily and said that he thought there would be a better opportunity in a few years. A moment later, he turned his gaze to the young lady and asked what she thought of her husband's gift. The young lady looked at him intently and, sighing heavily, said that she was seeing this gift for the first time. She looked closely at the gift and said that, unfortunately, She had not taken part in its selection. For this reason, she had nothing to say. She looked at the Duke intently and said that the dragon the general had caught 3 years ago was bigger than this one. All the ladies looked at her in shock. Alicia looked at the Duke intently and said that a bigger dragon would be a gift for his 80th birthday party. She smiled and said that for this reason she thought the meaning of the gift was as follows. She said that his grandson wished him to live a long life and be healthy until that moment. The general froze in place in surprise. She smiled and looked intently at everyone present, and also said that in a few years a larger dragon would appear. She looked at them with a smile and said that with the new dragon would come a new opportunity. A moment later, the Duke laughed wildly. He looked closely at his grandson and with a satisfied smile said that his wife was very unusual. The general looked sideways at the Duke and asked if he hadn't said that she was a very interesting woman. He looked closely at the Duke and said with a smile that later he himself could say that the amount of her bail was too small. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and wondered where she had been hiding all this time. A moment later, he called her name. He smiled a gentle and kind smile and told her that she could contact him at any time. He looked at her intently and said that he would like to talk to her. The young lady, in turn, froze in shock on the spot. They were very angry since the Duke did not honor them with such an honor. The young lady, in turn, looked at the Duke with a satisfied smile and said that she would certainly do as he said. Lucerne looked closely at his wife and said with a satisfied smile that, thanks to her, he enjoyed a family gathering for the first time. He said with a satisfied smile that it was very cool. A moment later, he smiled a tender smile at his wife and said that it was now time for them to leave. He smiled and extended his hand towards her and said that before this evening was over, they should have their wedding night. The young lady was taken aback for a moment and stood frozen in place. She did not know what to do. But a moment later, she took his hand. They walked slowly towards the carriage when suddenly they heard someone scream. Jacob shouted angrily at the young lady and insulted her. He walked up the steps to them. He was burning with anger. He shouted at the young lady that he fed and dressed her. He could not believe that she thanked him in such a way. He shouted at the general that he was just an idiot, and since he decided to be proud of having picked her up, he shouted that they were vile slaves. The general, in turn, looked intently at Jacob, but did not answer him in response to such rude insults. The young lady, in turn, froze in place. She understood that he would not leave it like that. He glanced sideways at his wife and told her not to look back and just move forward. She froze but didn't answer him. A moment later, he hurried to Jacob. Jacob was taken aback, as he did not understand why the general was rushing towards him at full speed. The general, in turn, rolled up his sleeves and looked intently at his relative. But a moment later, the Duke struck his relative in fury, and he fell to the ground with a crash. The moment the young lady left the hellish place, she heard the first words from her husband. The general looked intently at his wife with a radiant smile and called her. He congratulated his wife on their wedding with a radiant smile. She knew perfectly well that these were the most unpleasant words she had ever heard in her life, both this and the past. He looked intently at his wife and said that they would spend the night at the hotel today, and that tomorrow, early in the morning, they would be at the gates of his mansion. The young lady looked at her husband intently, her heart beating non-stop. She wondered if it was because she had witnessed someone hit Jacob for the first time. She looked intently at her husband and called him. A moment later, the young lady timidly asked if he agreed with the statement that being weak was a sin. The general looked at his wife in surprise, as he did not expect to hear such a question. But a moment later, he said that he agreed with this statement. The young lady, in turn, understood perfectly well that of course he could not answer differently, since he and the Duke were of the same blood. She understood perfectly well that she was very naive, since she thought that he did this for her sake. She knew that she was not his real wife, and that they simply had a contractual relationship. He looked closely at his wife, as he saw that she was very excited. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she really expected him to answer negatively to this question. Alicia sighed heavily and said that it was not so. She knew perfectly well that he would not answer in such a way. The young lady, in turn, timidly said that she simply said these words to satisfy the head of the house. He looked at her closely and thanked her for her honesty. Alicia said that she knows perfectly well that her life depends only on her. She looked at her husband intently and said that he should not worry, as she would not disturb him with her useless feelings or childishness. The young lady understood perfectly well that she had to try, and she had to keep everything as it was now. He looked at her intently and tenderly touched her face and said that she was very weak and he didn't even know what to do with it. He looked at her with a smile and asked how he could hate this weakness. He looked at her closely and with a soft smile asked if this was the answer she expected from him. He reached closer to her and tenderly told her that she should close her eyes, because it was moments like these that he really wanted to swallow her up. The young lady in turn obeyed her husband, and a moment later he kissed her with all his passion. Lapis, with tears in his eyes, shouted that he simply could not believe that the general had agreed to the marriage. Lazari looked intently at his brother and told him to calm down. Cullen screamed furiously that the young lady belonged to Jacob. He knew that this was not normal at all and was worried that she could be a spy. Nora looked at them intently and said that this marriage was not a sham, and that she was not a spy at all. The young men were hastily bombarding her with questions, as they wanted to know a lot about her. Nora hesitated, not knowing which question to answer. Ian looked closely at the young people, and said that the young lady was quiet and calm, and not a bad person at all. He smiled and said that she was not capable of deceiving the general, and no one was capable of doing so. They looked at him intently and, sighing heavily, said that it was logical. Lapis, in turn, was outraged that the general did not even tell them in advance that he was going to get married and did not invite them to the wedding. The young people looked at each other. They did not know what to answer. She screamed with tears in her eyes that he was simply neglecting them. She screamed that she would not let him get away with this. The general looked intently at his wife and asked if she couldn't come down. A moment later he sighed heavily and said that she should give him her hand. The young people were shocked by the general, as they knew that he was not like that at all. With lightning speed, the general picked up his wife in his arms and began to carry her out of the carriage. The young lady was taken aback and shouted that she could walk on her own. She glanced sideways at everyone present, as she wanted to make a good impression on the knights. Everyone present froze in surprise as they saw the mark on Alicia's neck. They were shocked and did not know what exactly happened in the carriage. The young lady sighed heavily. She thought that this was just a shameful moment. She quietly reached out to her husband and hid from all eyes. The young man ran up to the general at full speed. He said with a smile that they were greatly honored that the general and his wife would be staying at their hotel. He smiled and, looking at the general timidly, said that if he had free time, they could visit a salon near the hotel. The general looked at the young man with cold fury and said that whoever dared to disturb them on their wedding night would immediately say goodbye to life. The young man was frightened but did not answer. The general slowly and carefully laid his wife on the bed. She looked at him intently, knowing that the moment had come. A moment later, he leaned against the young lady and asked with a wicked grin where they would begin. The young lady froze in place for a moment. He quietly moved closer to her to kiss her. But suddenly, her stomach began to rumble. The young lady was taken aback and said with embarrassment that she had not eaten today because of her outfit. The general looked at his wife with a sweet smile. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that they could do with some refreshment. She looked at her husband with embarrassment, as she did not know what to answer. Sometime later, she was taking a bath. She sat quietly and thought about everything. Alicia sighed heavily, because until that moment, she had never lived in comfort and freedom. Unfortunately, she did not know what peace and warmth were. In her past life, people looked at her as something disgusting because of the burn scar, but unfortunately, she got used to those looks. She thought for a moment, because she knew that she was pathetic in her past life, and she didn't even have a desire to become happier. She sighed heavily, because she knew that this was very strange. She thought for a moment, as she did not know how she felt now. A moment later, she heard her husband enter the room. He looked at her intently and asked what she was doing. The young lady was taken aback and said sheepishly that she was doing nothing, just thinking for a moment. He looked at her intently and said that it was time for her to go out. He extended his hand to her with a smile and told her that she did not need to think about anything except her wedding night. Lucerne slowly threw a robe over the young lady. He looked at her closely and said that she was rather thin. She sighed heavily and said that she thought she was able to fulfill her marital duty. He looked closely at his wife and said that she had gone through all the madness with great fortitude. A moment later, he looked at her in surprise and froze for a moment. The general did not understand why she was crying in front of him now. He tenderly touched her face and asked if she was afraid. Alicia looked intently at her husband and felt his warm hands on her body. She understood that, despite the cold look and voice, next to this man she did not know what she felt. A moment later, she tenderly kissed him first. The general, in turn, squeezed his wife and pulled her closer to him. He greedily devoured her. A moment later, he slowly released his wife and, looking her straight in the eyes, asked if they had met anywhere before. Alicia froze for a moment and shuddered after his words. Lucerne looked at her and said that every time, like his grandfather, their glances crossed, her eyes filled with regret. He looked at her intently and asked why this could be, calling her a little ghost. He didn't hear an answer to his question as they turned to a loud sound outside the door. The knight shouting to the general that monsters were advancing from the reverse side of the mountain. The general looked intently at his wife and said that she should wait for him at the hotel. As he left, he said that she should not leave the room until he gave her permission. She watched him go silently. She looked intently at her husband, who was already talking with the knight. The general was surprised, as he knew very well that spring was still a long way off, and he did not understand where the surge of magical energy came from and why they ended up here. The young man looked at the general with excitement and shouted that a rebellion had begun. He said that the supporters of the conquered kingdom had awakened the monsters, and for this reason, the Soar's estate had already fallen, and they needed a plan to hold on to their territory. The young lady sighed heavily as she realized that this day had already arrived. She sighed heavily as she knew that their rebellion would end in defeat anyway. She knew that her husband would suppress the rebellion and receive a higher status as a reward. The young man looked at the general intently and said that the surrounding territories would send reinforcements, but unfortunately they had no commander. He looked at them intently and said that they should move out right now. He looked sideways at all his subordinates and said that they should finish in a week and return as soon as possible. Lapis looked at his friend closely and said that the general was not in the mood. Colin sighed heavily and said that their commander was disturbed on his wedding night. He looked at him sideways and said that he did not understand anything about this. The general looked closely at everyone present and said that Ian and Lazari were going with him to the Soar's estate, and Colin, Nora, and Lapis were to accompany his wife to the capital. The young people were shocked. They did not expect this, as they wanted to go with the general to the battlefield. They said that he could not do this to them. He looked angrily at everyone present and shouted at them that he had not given them permission to comment on his orders. Lapis looked at the young lady with anger, as he did not want to accompany her at all. The young lady, in turn, looked at him with a soft smile, but he quickly turned away from her gaze. The young lady, in turn, understood perfectly well that being responsible for security, instead of fighting on the front lines, was the same as not receiving an invitation to a party. She understood perfectly well that she would have reacted to this order in the same way. The general looked at his wife intently and said that she should go to the capital and stay there. He looked at her intently and said angrily that she should not forget that their first night was not over yet. He looked closely at his wife and said that when he returned, she should be ready. The young lady looked at her husband with embarrassment and said that she would be prepared for it. But a moment later, she said that he should be more careful in battle. Sometime later, the young lady arrived at her new home. She stood for a moment at the entrance as she was struck by its beauty. A moment later, she involuntarily screamed as someone pushed her. She sighed heavily and looked closely at the girl. She understood that this would not be easy. Alicia sighed heavily. She was sure that many people were looking at her now and seeing in front of them the maid who had been pouring out slop just a few days ago. A moment later, a man approached the young lady and introduced himself. He said his name was Henri and that he was the family butler. He looked at her intently and said that if she needed any assistance, she could feel free to contact him. She sighed heavily as she knew that everything would be fine. She looked closely at the butler and asked where the knights trained. The butler looked at the young lady in surprise, as he had not expected such a question at all. She looked at him intently and said that he should show her the place where the knights trained. The young lady, in turn, knew that she would try to do everything in her power while she was here. He looked at her closely and said that this was not a suitable place for a noble lady, and especially since most of the knights had already gone to war. Alicia looked closely at the butler but did not answer. The butler said that the troops were under the command of the general and she needed to inspect the castle. She looked closely at the butler and asked if the training ground was not part of the castle. The butler froze in surprise for a moment, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. A moment later, he quickly bowed to the young lady and said that he had overstepped his bounds and also asked for forgiveness. He looked intently at the lady and said that she should follow him. Sometime later, they came to the training ground and the butler showed everything to the young lady. The knights looked sideways at the young lady. They looked at her intently and whispered quietly, because they knew that the general would never have a relationship with her. Sometime later, she came into the kitchen. The butler looked at her intently and said that in this kitchen, they cook for the soldiers. She looked closely at all the dishes and asked if this was really what the soldiers were fed. The cook looked closely at her and said with a smile that this was indeed the case. The butler looked closely at the young lady as he saw the straight posture and rough hands. He saw a beautiful but emotionless face, and thought that she was a typical ruined aristocrat who had nothing left but pride. He watched the lady closely while she was talking. The butler sighed heavily as he now realized that he had been wrong about her. They walked around the manor for a while. The butler said that there are not many maids in this house, so they do not have enough labor, and he prepared a room for her so she should rest. Okay. He looked at her closely and said that it took several days to travel through the portal, but she must still be tired. A moment later, they froze in place as they heard someone scream. They looked at the picture in surprise as the young girls ran after the little pig. The young lady in turn froze in surprise and stared intently at the animal that was running towards her. A moment later, the little piglet ran up to the new mistress and sat down at her feet. She looked at her with surprise, but a moment later the young sorceress still managed to catch her animal, and she fell with a crash. She was in shock. She did not understand how long he could escape from the laboratory. A moment later, she was taken aback as she saw the young lady in front of her. Alicia looked intently at the young sorceress with a gentle smile. Lapis looked at the lady sullenly in turn. He did not answer, and turned around with the speed of lightning. The butler was shocked and shouted after her that she should have thanked the young lady. The butler sighed heavily and, looking at the lady, told her not to take him seriously and to understand, since things were very difficult for him and his brother. She looked intently at the butler and said with a smile that she understood everything, and that one should not expect high manners from wizards. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she really knew how to handle them. The young lady, in turn, looked intently at the butler with a sweet smile on her face. As soon as the young lady crossed the threshold of the house, she froze in shock. The young lady saw the clock of the turning world, roses of pure gold that were in the ancient relic. She noticed paintings that collectors would sell their souls for, but she was shocked that those relics were in chaotic order. She was in shock. She did not understand what was wrong with the house. The young lady was puzzled and did not understand how this was even possible. The butler sighed heavily and said that every time the general returned from the war, the imperial family gave him gifts. The butler said that, unfortunately, the general was not too keen on art, and therefore ordered all the gifts to be hung somewhere. He looked at the young lady intently and said that she did not need to worry because the truly important artifacts were in the treasury. The young lady was horrified. She thought that most likely these treasures were stored in a more terrible state. She sighed heavily and said that she simply couldn't. So a moment later she rolled up her sleeves and said that a thorough cleaning was about to begin. The butler looked at her in surprise but did not stop her. He was surprised because the young lady had put the castle in order in just a few days. He was amazed that she did everything immediately after her arrival. He looked at her closely and asked if she had met the servants. The young lady sighed heavily and said that everyone was very busy and she did not want to take up their time. For this reason, she would approach them herself later and introduce herself. She walked leisurely through the castle. The maids were busy with their work and looked intently at their mistress. But a moment later, the young maid accidentally pushed the vase. She frowned as she realized that the piece of art was about to break and that would be the end of her. But a moment later, she opened her eyes and froze in place. The young lady looked closely at the maid and with a smile asked her if she was okay. She smiled and told the maid to be more careful in the future. The maid froze in surprise and timidly thanked her mistress. The butler saw that the atmosphere in the mansion had changed dramatically. He slowly entered the young lady's office. He wondered if it could be because the estate now had a real owner. The young lady looked at the butler closely and said with a smile that she had checked the accounting book and thought they could save more on this side of the expenses. He was surprised because he had not expected her to be able to figure out the accounting reports. The young lady smiled and said that she had lived in a monastery for some time. Mother Superior loved her very much, and so one day she asked her to teach her accounting. He was surprised since she was now talking about a war heroine. He looked at the young lady intently as he realized that she was simply incredible. She smiled and said that she needed to make an inventory of the art pieces in the house. He looked closely at the young lady, for the more he got to know her, the more she surprised him. He realized that all the changes had greatly transformed the mansion. The knights in the dining room were discussing the young lady. They said that she had begun to rule over everything, as if she had lived in the mansion for many years. They said that she behaved very nicely with the local servants. The young man listened to their conversations with fury. He was burning with anger and was furious. He could not believe that the young lady was behaving like this. He shouted that they, regardless of whether she was the mistress of the house or not, he still could not come to terms with it. A moment later, a young lady entered the room. She looked intently at everyone present. The young man looked at his friend with a smile on his face. He smiled and asked if he had lived well. They were a little puzzled as they'd eaten black bread, pasta, and grilled pork knuckles before. Lopi sighed heavily. He said that, of course, he hadn't lost weight, but he'd eaten about the same in prison. Nora looked at her friend closely, and said that he was not a little child at all and should stop complaining about the food. He sighed heavily and said that those who had not sat would not understand. Colin sighed heavily and said that if they were fed like that in the war, they would kill all the rebels out of anger. He was a little puzzled and offended because he did not understand why they were not taken. He sighed heavily, as he did not know what was in the mansion that needed to be guarded. The wizard, in turn, was burning with rage. He screamed that he could not accept this. He screamed that he was very angry that he was not back in the house. He screamed with rage and was burning with fire, since he could not even go out onto the battlefield. He simply could not come to terms with the fact that he was left on the sidelines. But a moment later, the young man froze in place in surprise as he saw the young lady. He looked at her intently, as he did not expect her to come to them. The young lady looked at the butler and asked if today was the day the general and his men were having lunch. She said that in theory she should accompany him, but today she would go alone since he was not there yet. The butler looked at the young lady with concern and asked if she was really serious now. He said with concern that, unfortunately, the general had not yet had time to take care of bodyguards for his wife. He said that his subordinates could behave very rudely towards her. Alicia looked closely at the butler and said that she had not yet had time to meet everyone, but they seemed like good people. She said that they did not swear, did not raise their hands, did not order people around, even if they had complaints. He looked at her closely and wondered if she was always kind to people. He looked intently at the young lady and began to list all the knights who were in the order and all their shortcomings. The young lady looked closely at everyone present. She looked at the knight because even though he was now free, she had heard that he was serving time under the article, executor without blood and tears. The young man looked at the young lady intently and with surprise because he did not understand why she was laughing. He knew very well that usually, if a noblewoman had to be among soldiers alone, she usually cried and was afraid. He looked closely at the young lady because he realized that she was incredibly brave. She looked closely at everyone present and greeted them with a gentle smile. A moment later, she looked at them in surprise and asked why Lapis was among them. He looked at the young lady with irritation and surprise and asked if she was not happy with his presence. She looked closely at the young man and with a smile quoted him the employment contract and one of its clauses, saying that he had the right not to go anywhere on the 4th Tuesday of every month and that today was that day. Alicia looked at him and with a soft smile said that she would order him some minced meat and ask him to send it to his room so that he could enjoy the meal in peace. She said that wizards needed solitude from time to time since magic was creative. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she would tell the general about this later. Colin looked closely at the young lady. He did not understand why she was trying to curry favor with the young wizard. Alicia walked slowly up to Colin and greeted him. She asked if it was really him. He looked at her intently and said his name was Colin. She sighed heavily and said that the combination of dishes was simply terrible, and she would tell the chef to change the diet. She sighed heavily and said that it was a really disgusting menu. He looked at her in surprise, wondering if she knew that the combination was so disgusting. He looked at her intently and timidly asked if she had been there for an hour. She, surprised, looked at him and with a smile asked where she should be. He frowned and looked at the young lady and said that he meant a place where the sky was in a cage. He looked at her intently and said that she must understand what he was talking about. The young lady, in turn, looked at him with a tender smile, but she knew that shortly before her death, Jacob had been accused of drug trafficking and had spent several days in prison. She looked at the knight with a smile and said that she had simply heard a lot. She looked at him intently and said that he was unjustly sentenced to such a severe punishment, and therefore she should be attentive to such trifles. The young man was amazed. He understood that she knew that he was falsely accused and put in prison. The young lady looked at everyone present with a smile and told them to all join in, as luckily there was a large selection of dishes on her table. He looked at her intently and asked if she wasn't afraid of him. Alicia looked at him in bewilderment and asked if she should really be afraid of her husband's subordinates. He looked at her intently but did not answer. A moment later, the young lady looked at everyone present with a smile and told them to help themselves. The young man was amazed by the beauty and sophistication of all the dishes. He quickly thanked the young lady for the generous table. Sometime later, the young lady was slowly returning to her chambers, and on her way she met a wizard. Alicia looked closely at the young wizard and asked if he needed to send an assistant. He sighed heavily and told her the article from the employment contract. A moment later, the young lady quoted the article he'd mentioned a few minutes earlier. She looked at him intently and said she'd heard him. The young man fell to the ground with a crash. He was astonished that she knew his agreement. He looked at her in surprise and asked, "What about Article 33? She looked at him intently and quickly quoted the article to him. He looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she had finished reading his employment contract. She looked at him intently and said that this was not so. He looked at the young lady with a smirk, as he knew that she could not read the entire contract. She looked at the young wizard with a smile and said that she remembered him completely. He froze in place in shock and surprise, as he had not expected to hear anything like that at all. A moment later, he said that she knew everything and that it was very wonderful. He sighed heavily and said that in any case, it was not important enough to notify the knights. Alicia looked closely at the young wizard and apologized for not being able to tell him about the wedding in advance. She sighed heavily and said that, as he already knew, everything had been prepared in a hurry. He looked sideways at the young lady and said that it was none of his business. He did not understand why she was apologizing. Shivering from the cold, he said that he would certainly take revenge on them since the adults were of no use. She looked closely at the young wizard and said with a soft smile that she was asking for understanding, not forgiveness. She said that failure to comply with the contents of the employment contract could be determined by the moment he made a mistake, but she wanted him to understand that she was not in a position to invite anyone to the wedding. She looked closely at the young man and said that she really hoped that he would be in her position because then she did not know him at all. The young wizard looked at the young lady with tears in his eyes. He looked at her intently and in surprise because he did not understand what kind of person she was. War is a very difficult period of time for all residents, but there were also those people who quickly and easily coped with the hardships of war. The young lady looked at the butler in surprise, as she did not expect to see him at such a late time. He looked at the young lady intently and said that reading books was very useful, but she should not forget to take care of her eyes. The young lady looked at him with a smile and thanked him for his concern. The butler looked timidly at the young lady. He hesitated, not knowing how to start the conversation. She looked at him in surprise, as she saw that he wanted to say something. He looked at her intently and said that he had received a telegram. He said that it seemed that the war had dragged on. The young lady sighed heavily. She had known this even before. She remembered her husband's words. He said that he would sort everything out in a week, but she knew that the battle with the rebels would last about 2 months. Alicia knew that a huge number of wizards would have to be called to that area. The butler looked at her intently and said that the general would return soon, but he was not there. But he asked the butler to give her something. He said that it was not a bad medicine. He looked at the young lady intently and said that it was some kind of dietary supplement. She glanced sideways at the medicine he presented to her. She sighed heavily and said that she would drink it a week before the general returned, and most likely it would be next month. He looked intently at the young lady and said anxiously that the general would soon return, but she interrupted him. She looked at him closely and said that it was enough to take birth control pills a week before the event. The butler was taken aback, as he realized that she was aware of everything that was happening. She looked at him intently and said that next time he should be more careful, since she did not need unverified information. He sighed heavily and wished her good night. He was a little surprised since the young lady had been planning to drink a week before the general's arrival. He was worried because he didn't understand how she would know when he would return. She sighed heavily, as she had been about to ask Lucerne about it first. Now that she had it from him directly, she felt like she was back in reality. She knew that having a child in a contract relationship made no sense. She sighed heavily, as she realized that a whole month had already passed since she arrived at the mansion. She knew that she should not relax. Alicia knew that her husband was interested in her body, but she could not be sure that nothing would change after he returned from the war. She knew that escape was good, but she also knew that she needed to think about her own safety first. She briefly considered the possibility that they could have a wonderful family in the future, but she knew that her goal now was to survive. Anything else was an unforgivable luxury. Alicia knew perfectly well that all the rules and conditions had been met, but she couldn't help but hope that he would divorce her successfully. She sighed heavily, knowing it was time to return to reality. Days passed. The young lady spent them in the company of all household members. She established friendly contact with everyone. It is also time for her to use the medicine. Sometime later, with a radiant smile, she gave orders to all the employees on where to put what. Sometime later, the butler entered the room and said with a beaming smile that the war was already over and the general was planning something special for tomorrow. The young lady looked intently at the butler, but said nothing. Everyone in the city joyfully celebrated the victory that the general had brought them. The young lady, in turn, was very upset. She said that the general had simply been fooled. The marquise looked at her daughter intently and said that they also could not believe it. She sighed heavily and said that she simply could not understand how the general could marry a rag that they trampled on the floor. The Marquis looked at them closely and said that there was nothing special about this, since when choosing a spouse, people often look only at their title and the antiquity of their lineage. He was furious and couldn't believe that their daughter was crying because of him. He shouted that he would definitely tell the general everything he thought about this as soon as he had the opportunity. The Marquise left her husband to resolve this issue as soon as possible. Carol smiled and said that she knew what to do about it. She looked at her parents closely and said with a satisfied smile that she would solve this problem herself. She looked at them with a smirk and said that she would show everyone that she was not an ordinary girl. Carol looked at her father closely and said with a satisfied smirk that he should help her find some people. The young lady looked closely at her reflection in the mirror. She remembered her husband, who had said that on the night he returned she should be ready. She slowly began to undress. She hoped that he was still joking with her, but a moment later, she was taken aback as she heard a loud knock on the door. She was very scared and wondered if she had misheard it. She looked closely at the door, which was locked. A moment later, the young lady was taken aback and froze in place in surprise as she saw her husband in front of her. He looked at her intently with a small smile on his face. She looked at him in surprise and called out. He sighed heavily and asked why she was so surprised. She looked at him sharply and said that she had heard that he was returning tomorrow along with the knights. He looked at her sharply and said that the knights would go through the main gate as planned tomorrow morning, and that he had business at home. She was surprised because she did not understand why he left his warriors. She wondered what the matter was that he was in such a hurry. He looked at her intently and said that it had been a long time since they had promised each other. He looked at her intently and said that he thought she understood what he was talking about. The young lady said sheepishly that she was about to go to bed. She looked at him in surprise and asked why he had come from another room. She looked at him intently and said that the door was locked and had never been opened before. She timidly asked if this was his office. A moment later, he threw her onto the bed, and with a satisfied grin said that everything was right, since before this was his bedroom, and now this bed had become a marital one. The young lady froze for a moment. She stared into his red eyes. They frightened her. She stared at him with embarrassment, as she felt like he was ready to eat her. Alicia asked if he would be heading to the gate early the next morning. She said that he needed to greet the knights as well. She sighed heavily and moved away from him a little, saying that for that reason he needed to sleep. He looked at her intently and asked for a moment where she was going. He looked intently at his wife, and a moment later kissed her passionately. The young lady was excited, as even his kiss did not allow her to think about anything. She moved away from him a little, as her heart was ready to jump out of her chest. He was taken aback and looked at her in surprise. A moment later, he fell into her lap and, sighing heavily, said that they would not do it today. He sighed heavily and said that in any case, they only had a few hours to sleep before the holiday. The general sighed heavily and said that he was very sorry, but they would have to wait. She looked at him embarrassedly, but did not answer. He looked closely at his wife, and with a gentle smile said that she would still have to repay the debt, and very soon. She sighed heavily and said she was so sorry. She thought they wouldn't stop at kissing. She wondered if it was because she was so surprised by his appearances, but her heart was still pounding. She looked at him intently and asked if she could go outside now. Alicia said that she had no idea that he had ordered her not to go outside. He sighed heavily and said that he thought he would deal with the rebels faster, but he did not expect that everything would drag on for so long. He said that she did not seem to go out much. Lucerne looked at her sharply and said that she didn't need to make any plans for tomorrow afternoon. She looked at him in surprise, not understanding what he was talking about. He sighed heavily and said that he would like to have lunch with her. The young lady was surprised as she did not expect to hear such a nose. She already agreed with him. The general told his wife that otherwise she could do as she wanted. He said that she could go out and she could also stay at home. She looked at the young man in surprise as she understood that he really was unpredictable. Sometime later, morning came. She was a little excited, as she did not remember when she had managed to fall asleep. Alicia stared out the window, but a moment later she noticed that someone had covered her with a blanket. Alicia stared at the edge of the bed, feeling as if she had dreamed it all. Everyone present looked closely at the young lady and wished her a safe journey. She glanced sideways at the knights and said they had done a fine job. Nora looked sharply at her mistress and said it was all right, since most of the military didn't like imperial banquets anyway. Alicia said she needed to stop somewhere before going to the banquet. She looked closely at the young men and said that it would not take long, and she also informed them that the general had given her permission. A moment later, they arrived at their destination. The young men looked closely at the knights and said that they should wait outside for their mistress. Nora was extremely indignant. She said that this wouldn't do, because the parade would start soon and the streets would be overcrowded. The guards looked closely at the knights. The young men told them to leave immediately. The young lady looked closely at her protector and said that everything was fine and she would be back in a few minutes. She said with a smile that she had nothing to worry about. Ian looked at the lady intently and said in a worried tone that she must promise not to go outside. The young lady slowly approached the door of the brokerage office. She turned around and looked at her knights, smiling and saying that they didn't need to worry, as she would be fine. The young lady knew that since this agency was an expert in the real estate market and conducted dozens of purchase and sale transactions on a daily basis, it was not surprising that they had such strict security. She knew that for now her husband should not know exactly what she was going to buy. A moment later, she entered the office. The man looked closely at the young lady and greeted her, asking if she was looking for anything in particular. The young lady looked at him intently and said that she was interested in a piece of land located near the enchanted forest of Ulif. The man was taken aback as he did not expect to hear such a thing. He looked at the young lady in surprise and asked where she had learned such information. He looked at her closely and said that the piece of land in question would soon be put up for auction, but that it was not something a noble lady would be looking for. The young lady beamed and said that she had been there before and that she was interested in buying the place rather than making a short-term investment. She looked at the man closely and said that she wanted this land. A moment later, the man handed her a document with an estimated price. She looked at the document closely and realized that it was a little more expensive than she had expected. She looked closely at the documents because she knew that if this would help make her husband's head, then she had to do everything for this. The man looked closely at the young lady. He understood that it would be impossible for a simple and noble lady to have such information. He wondered what family she was from. He looked at the young lady intently and said that he would tell her something, but only because she looked like a knowledgeable person. He said that after the previous owner of the land disappeared, a rumor began to spread that it brought misfortune. He looked at Alicia intently and said that if she wanted a country house, he could provide her with a better option. The young lady, in turn, was a little surprised by such a statement, but looked at him with a radiant smile. A moment later, she said with a smile that she did not need it, and she liked this land. She looked at him intently and said that the whole garden was full of hot springs, and she hoped that they would be lucky to find one if they started digging in that area. The man was surprised. He understood that the young lady did not have any plan at all. She understood perfectly well that if their conversation now reached her husband's ears, it would be a good excuse. A moment later, the man looked at her and said that he would send her the detailed information to the address she had provided. The young lady in turn agreed with him, but a moment later she was taken aback. He looked at her intently and said that he had a luxurious mansion for single women, and if she was interested in it, he could send her information about it. She thought for a moment and asked him to send all the information about it. She knew that it would be nice for her to immediately find a place for a quiet life after the divorce. While walking down the street, the young lady accidentally bumped into some men. She was a little nervous because the street was crowded. A moment later, she looked around. As she realized that the apparatus had already started, she looked intently at all the knights. The people chanted as if they were very happy that the general had returned victorious. A moment later, the young lady looked into the distance and saw her husband. Everyone was grateful to the general, as they knew that he always stood guard over their empire. The young lady, in turn, looked intently at her husband, who was standing next to the young lady. She stared at him, unable to take her eyes off him. Alicia looked at him in surprise and wondered if this was really the same man she had seen last night. She knew that if they hadn't agreed to have lunch today, she would really think it was all just a dream. She was a little excited and confused, because she realized that he was so close to her, but there was a huge gap between them. She looked at her husband in surprise and wondered if she had imagined it or if they had actually met each other's eyes. A moment later, she turned around as she understood that in such a crowd, it was simply impossible. The young lady was immersed in her thoughts and did not hear her name being called. The knights shouted to their mistress that there were too many people in the street and she should go to the back. In response, she said that she understood everything. The young lady, in turn, walked slowly towards the back gate. At the same time, the general was closely watching her trace. Alicia walked slowly into the alley and was taken aback for a moment. She sighed heavily and walked slowly. She was a little excited. The young lady slowly looked around. She knew that she had simply walked out into a deserted alley, but she did not understand why it had suddenly become quiet and deserted. The young lady was taken aback as someone grabbed her from behind and covered her mouth. She didn't even have time to scream. A moment later, she was thrown to the ground and kicked. The young man smirked and shouted that she looked like an aristocrat. He was a little nervous because he didn't know if they could do it. His accomplice said with a satisfied smile that of course they could do that. Since they had been told to ruin her appearance and throw her in a deserted alley, they looked at her with a smirk and contempt. The young man smirked and said that she would finally become a novice. The young lady in turn saw the young men dimly. She sensed a faint scent of nutmeg. She realized that it was used as a drug. She noticed that the young men were unprofessional in their field because they had not taken into account that some time would have to pass before it would fully take effect. She understood perfectly well that while she was still able to move, she needed to get out of the alley immediately. A moment later, she hit the young man with all her might, and he fell to the ground with a crash. The young man looked at her with fury and shouted at her to stop. Alicia ran as fast as she could from the alley. She knew she couldn't stop. She understood perfectly well that if someone recognized her now, she would not be able to avoid ridicule. A moment later, she heard men's voices. They asked with a satisfied grin what establishment she was from. The young lady, breathing heavily, continued to move. She sighed heavily and stopped. She looked around because she understood that she needed to come to her senses somewhere. She understood perfectly well that she had to find a place where she could hide. The young ladies, in turn, engaged in casual conversation. A moment later, they were taken aback as they saw her in a very sad state. Arian looked at the young lady with a smirk and called out to her. Alicia was taken aback when she heard her voice. She looked at the young lady mockingly and asked what she looked like. Alicia was shocked. She did not expect to see anyone at all. A moment later, the young ladies began to whisper among themselves, watching the general's wife with a smirk. The young lady looked at Alicia with a smirk and mockery and said that such a question could not be, and that it was probably some courtesan who had run away from her client. Alicia, in turn, sat quietly on the ground. She was exhausted, and for this reason, she could not utter a word. Alicia glared at the young lady. She knew perfectly well that they were involved in her attack, but she was in no mood to say anything to anyone right now. A moment later, the general approached her. He covered her with his jacket. He softly called his wife and asked where she had run off to since he was looking for her. The young ladies were shocked. They did not expect to see the general at all. The young lady, in turn, looked at her husband in panic and timidly called him. A moment later, she collapsed to the ground, exhausted. He looked closely at his wife and with a grin said that they still had plans. He smiled and said that it seemed that she had had such a good time that now she could not stand on her feet. She looked at him in surprise and called out, but he said that she should remain silent now. A moment later, he glanced sideways at everyone present and told his wife that he too was at the limit of his abilities. Everyone present was shocked, as they did not expect to hear anything like this. They began to whisper. He hugged his wife with a smile and said that it was time for them to go back, and he would make her pay for every second of his wait. A moment later, someone called out to them. The young lady looked sharply at the general and told him to stop. She looked closely at the general and asked if the two of them had really been doing something like that right there on the street. The young lady looked at the general in surprise, as she was expecting an answer. Lucerne said they were supposed to have lunch together, but ended up alone. Lucerne said with a satisfied grin that a storm of sparks had flown between them, and he simply couldn't resist. The young people were surprised, but still they knew that they were newlyweds, and they could not expect anything else from them. The general looked sideways at everyone present and said that they were not finished yet, so they would like to leave. The young lady sighed heavily. She knew that, thanks to her husband, the danger was over. She knew that she had been rescued by the one who had organized the whole event, while the general was seething with rage. The young lady looked at her husband in surprise and asked how he was able to find her. He sighed heavily and quietly told her that the decoration on her neck was not an ordinary one. He said that the knights had told him that she was missing. She was surprised, as she knew that it was practically impossible to come right away. He looked at his wife and said that he had now arrived at the hotel where they were supposed to meet. The general looked intently at his wife and asked what had happened to her. The young lady was trembling in her turn. She could not speak clearly, but she still managed to tell him that she was attacked by two tramps. She simply could not believe that he dropped everything and came looking for her. She sighed heavily and said that she could smell nutmeg and dried cloves on them. She did not understand why he did this. The general sighed heavily and said that he understood everything and it was a paralyzer. She continued to speak, but he stopped her. He said that her tongue had hardened and she did not need to continue the dialogue. The young lady sighed heavily. She wondered if he was really worried about her. She just couldn't believe it, and decided to just not think about such trifles. He slowly approached his wife and said that she needed to drink cocoa with alcohol. He looked at her closely and said that this should dull the effect on the implementer. The young lady, in turn, slowly began to drink the cocktail. A moment later, knights burst into her room and called her, but the general, in turn, used his magic and they fell to the ground with a crash. He looked at them with fury and asked where they had been. The young people asked the general for forgiveness. They said that there was no forgiveness for them, and they would accept any punishment. Alicia glared at them and told them to stop as the situation was out of control. She glared at them and said that it was her decision to go alone, so the responsibility was entirely hers. Lucerne looked at his wife with fury and shouted that she had no right to decide when and where to take responsibility for the situation. The young lady drooped for a moment. She trembled with fear in front of her husband and could not utter a word. The general sighed heavily. He looked at the knights intently and said that the attackers looked like vagabonds, and if this was the work of Jacob or Marco, this would be the end for them. He looked at them with fury and told them to bring them to him alive or dead. They looked closely at the young lady and said that they would do everything. The general came closer to his wife and asked how she was feeling. She sighed heavily and said that her tongue was already moving a little. She was very sweet. She sighed heavily and said that the rest of her limbs were still motionless. The young lady was taken aback when her husband touched her lips. He looked at his wife with a grin and said that she was very sweet. She was taken aback and asked her husband, with embarrassment, why he had suddenly acted in such a way. He looked at her intently and, with a satisfied smile, said that the paralyzer had made her relax a little. A moment later, he moved closer to her and began to kiss her tenderly. The young lady was surprised and trembled every time he touched her. He looked intently, and she looked at her wife and with a satisfied smile said that if the body warms up, all the feelings can return. She looked at him in surprise and asked him to wait a little. A moment later, he threw her onto the bed. She knew there was no point in stopping him. He looked at her intently and said that they say that feeling is alive when it is directed towards the center of the body. He looked closely at his wife and said with a satisfied grin that no matter what, rumors that they were here together would spread at the speed of light, so they couldn't leave. He smiled and asked what she thought about it. He touched every inch of her body tenderly and said that they could quickly get rid of the action of the implementer. The general, in turn, began to slowly undress. He looked at her predatorily and said with a satisfied smile that he had been holding out for several months. Alicia, in turn, froze in place in surprise. She could not utter a word. He caressed his wife for a while, but a moment later he said that she should look at him. The young lady turned away from him and closed her eyes, as she could not look him in the eyes. Sometime later, the whole family gathered together for dinner. They had a very heated conversation and were arguing with all their might. The general looked intently at Marco and asked with a grin if he was really expecting collective repentance. At the same time, he looked at the general with mockery. The young lady sat quietly next to him and trembled. She was puzzled as he touched her bare leg with a satisfied smile. She was puzzled and did not want this at all. A moment later, she heard a sound and looked intently at the general. She was very excited and couldn't believe that he was like this. The Duke looked intently at his grandson and said that this was his last warning, and if it happened again, he could expect no mercy. A moment later, he said with rage that he now felt relieved, since he would no longer have relations with the family of such bastards. He walked up to the young man and poured wine on his head. Everyone present was shocked. He looked at the young man intently and said that the temple killers they had sent had been received with all goodwill and that he would pay him compensation. A moment later, he left without saying goodbye. The young lady looked after him, surprised. After a while, she opened her eyes and froze for a moment. Alicia glanced sideways at her husband. He looked at her closely and stroked her face tenderly and asked if she had had a bad dream. She looked at him tenderly and wondered if she was still asleep. She was surprised and at the same time puzzled because she knew that in her dreams of the past and in reality, a man came to her aid every time. She looked at him intently and wondered if she could allow herself this sweet feeling. She looked closely at her husband as she still continued to have doubts, but she still accepted his help and tenderly leaned on his arm. He looked at her closely and with a smile said that he had once held back because she said it was hard, but if she continued to look at him like that, he would not stop. The general leaned towards his wife and saw that she frowned and closed her eyes in embarrassment. He said with tenderness in his voice that he could not ignore her desire. A moment later, he kissed his wife with all his passion, and she reciprocated. Sometime later, they were walking together around the hotel. The young lady, in turn, was immersed in her thoughts. She knew that by morning the entire effect of the implementer had completely disappeared, but her eyes still hurt. She looked closely at her husband, as she understood that he did not care what had happened earlier. A moment later, the young lady called out to the general with a radiant smile. Alicia looked at her intently. She was a little surprised. She knew that before her now stood the only Empress of Ilion in the Empire. She is one of the strongest heirs to the throne. With the speed of lightning, she ran up to the general and with a satisfied smile asked what happened yesterday. She smiled and said that she was waiting for him in a separate room with her mother. The young lady looked at her intently, as she knew that she was still a knight, part of the guards of the imperial family. The Empress looked at the young lady with a grin. A moment later, the young lady in turn introduced herself and said with a smile that she was very pleased to meet the Empress. In turn, her lady looked at the Empress with a frown and intent gaze. She knew that the Empress would propose to her husband in just 5 years. The young lady in turn knew perfectly well that this proposal was made for political purposes. The Empress looked closely at the young man and said with a smile that if he missed this meeting, his father would certainly be angry. He sighed heavily and said that he would try not to be late. Alicia was surprised, as she saw that they had a very friendly and warm relationship, and she could easily address him by name. She looked at them closely, as she understood that there could be other reasons. The Empress looked at the young lady with a smile on her face and said that she was very sorry. She sighed heavily and said with a soft smile that she had really hoped that the general would introduce his wife to her yesterday. The young lady was momentarily taken aback, as she realized that if the Empress was talking about yesterday evening, then she was probably talking about the dinner to which her husband had invited her. She drooped for a moment as she realized that he had no intention of eating with her at all, but that he simply wanted to introduce her to the princess. The maid slowly opened the windows and sighed heavily. She told the young lady that the master had immediately left for a meeting at the palace. She looked at the lady intently and said that if he had gone there, he would not return for several days. Alicia was a little worried. She didn't understand what was happening to her lately. She, in turn, wondered if it was all about the image of the general, who was so different from the one she had seen in her past life. She knew perfectly well that they didn't see each other very often at that time. She learned all the information about him from the terrible rumors that relentlessly pursued him. She knew that compared to all the rumors, he was much more gentle. A moment later, she threw all thoughts away, because she knew that she was thinking about the wrong thing now. A moment later, the young lady looked at the maids as they were whispering something. She looked at them in surprise, because she did not understand what had happened, why they had such serious faces. She slowly approached the maid and asked what had happened. A moment later, the maid told both of them to her mistress. Everyone looked at the knight in surprise and excitement. Nora screamed furiously that she, unfortunately, had failed to fulfill her knightly duty, which had put her mistress in danger. She screamed that she would atone for this mistake with her death, but everyone stopped her. A moment later, Alicia entered the room and looked intently at the knight. She was surprised and asked Nora what she was doing now. Nora looked at the lady in surprise, as she did not expect to see her at all. A moment later, everyone left the room in a hurry. The young lady sighed heavily and looked intently at the whole. She said that the knight's life belongs to his master. She looked at her closely and said that she chose to run away instead of being responsible. Alicia sighed heavily and told her that it was not like her at all. She looked at her intently and asked if this was her way of taking responsibility. Nora stood quietly and did not answer the lady. A moment later, the young lady handed her a handkerchief. Alicia looked at her closely and asked if she remembered the dried pansies that everyone in the monastery received when they took their first vows. Alicia looked at her closely and said with a soft smile that she knew she grew up in a convent. She smiled and said that she grew up in a convent too. She smiled and said that after leaving there, she found herself in the hands of Cartier, and Nora, in turn, became a knight. Alicia said with a smile that a person who truly reveals himself in his place is like a light shining from afar. She looked at her closely and said with a gentle smile that for her, Nora was just such a person. Alicia smiled and told her that she had to promise not to do anything like that again. A moment later, Nora knelt before the lady and said that she was a knight and swore an oath before her and would lay down her life for her protection. The Empress looked closely at the young man and said with a smile that today she understood why he took the day off. She looked at him with a satisfied smile and said that his wife was a real beauty. The general, in turn, frowned for a moment and thought. He told the Empress that he had not given her permission to call him by his name. He sighed heavily and said that although she had been calling him that since childhood, now he had a wife, and for this reason, He had dressed so that she would refrain from such treatment in the future. The Empress was shocked, as she did not expect this. She looked at him with an innocent smile and asked why he was so cruel in their relationship. He looked at the Empress with a furious frown but did not answer. A moment later, she said that she understood him and would now call him General. He looked at her in surprise and asked how she even knew that he had booked a hotel yesterday. She sighed heavily and said that he never introduced his wife, so she was curious. She sighed heavily and said that she would like to apologize if he thought she was rude. She looked closely at the young man, as she had known him very well for a very long time, and they were very close. She looked at him intently, for she knew perfectly well that there was something in his voice that sometimes made people involuntarily cringe, and until now she had never seen him smile. The Empress walked forward slowly and asked what kind of person his wife was. He shuddered as he had not expected such a question. She sighed heavily and said that she very much hoped that he did not treat his wife the same way as she did. She sighed heavily and said that noble ladies were quite sensitive. He looked closely at the Empress and said that all she had from a noble lady was her manners. He looked closely at the Empress and said that his wife was very cautious, but unyielding, and that she also had hundreds of thoughts in her head that he had not even guessed about. He sighed heavily and said that she was a very interesting girl. The Empress looked at the General in surprise and froze for a moment. She was surprised to see his sweet and gentle smile when he spoke about his wife. A few days later, everyone at the banquet was discussing the General and what he had received as a reward. They were saying that before this he had not had a noble title, and everything went to the country. They were saying that it seemed that it was not in vain that he had married and received a title after all. They discussed the fact that his wife had not been attending receptions due to poor health, but they still found it hard to believe, and they admitted the idea that their marriage was simply by contract, but some ladies said that they had been seen at the hotel a few days ago. The General, in turn, looked intently at everyone present. The young man sighed heavily. He was already very tired of sitting at the banquet, which had lasted for several days. He was a little puzzled as he had some business left that he needed to resolve urgently. He suddenly remembered his wife, who looked at him with tenderness and sadness. He sighed heavily as he realized that he was now thinking about his wife without any good reason. A moment later, he sighed heavily as he realized that this should be enough to please the Emperor. He sighed heavily and began to get up, as if he wanted to return home as soon as possible. But a moment later, the knight called him. He came closer to him and whispered something quietly. The knight bowed and said that it seemed they wanted to see how he would react to the insult. The General clenched his fists in anger and asked if they were really interested in throwing out his defiled wife or not. The knight sighed heavily and said that it was exactly like that. The General looked into the distance with a grin and said that apparently he would have to postpone his return home a little. A moment later, he saw the Marquis in the distance, chatting cheerfully with everyone. He looked closely at his knight and told him to prepare everything. He knew very well that the Marquis was one of those who trembled over the secrecy of his personal life. He was afraid of his own wife, because it was thanks to her and her blood connection with the royal family that he was able to know. But to raise his family, the Marquis was puzzled, because he did not understand where he was now. A moment later, he came to his senses and froze in place with horror as he saw the General in person. The General in turn looked at the man calmly, smoking a cigarette. The General looked at the man closely and said that it looked like he had a very bad hobby, namely an illegal gambling house. Some time ago, the Marquis sat in a circle of lovely ladies with a contented and playful smile. He was very happy and pleased, as he was lucky. The young lady looked closely at her dear client and said with a smile that he had already won several games. She came closer to him and said that he could easily move to their VIP room. The young man smiled and told the Marquis that he had even brought the girls with him and that he had had a lot of fun. The Marquis was shocked as a dealer from a gambling house was now standing in front of him. He was shocked because he didn't expect him to be a man. A moment later, the young man introduced himself with a smile and said that he was a knight of the Black Lions. The Marquis was furious. He shouted that he was an aristocrat of the empire. He looked intently at everyone present and shouted angrily that he had simply visited a gambling house. But a moment later, a bag of tools fell in front of him with a crash. The Marquis froze in shock, shaking with fear. He looked intently at the General and asked him in horror to listen, as a simple misunderstanding had occurred. The General came closer to him and, looking straight into his eyes, asked if he really thought that he would get away with it after touching his wife. The General told the Marquis that he should have been prepared for anything, and that he would now pay for everything. The young man told the Marquis with a smile not to worry so much because when everything was over, the best wizards of the empire would erase his memory. He looked closely at the Marquis and with a satisfied smile said that he would open his eyes at the hotel in a state of alcoholic intoxication, with traces of sexual intercourse and at the same time not remembering anything at all. The Marquis froze in place from shock and fear. The general slowly approached the man with a hammer in his hands. He looked at the Marquis with a grin and said that his wife would be very upset by his betrayal, and perhaps she would not even forgive him for the rest of their lives. The young man walked down the corridor with a beaming smile. He was very happy, because yesterday he had taught the Marquis, who was behind the men who attacked his mistress, a lesson. He knew that if only he hadn't been ordered to remain silent, he would have certainly bragged to his mistress. A moment later he was taken aback and froze in place in surprise as he saw the maid. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she had in her hands. The maid smiled and said that she had brought today's newspaper and was just about to take it to the mistress. He looked intently at the maid. She smiled and asked if he could pass the newspaper for her. A moment later he entered his mistress's room with a smile. The young lady greeted the young wizard with a smile and asked if he would like a cup of tea. Lapis, with a radiant and joyful smile, told the lady that he had brought her a newspaper. But for a moment he froze in place. Alicia looked at him in surprise and asked what happened. He hesitated and timidly said that nothing had happened. She came closer to the wizard and, leaning over, asked if there was really something interesting written in the newspaper. The young wizard squeezed the newspaper harder. He was shocked and did not understand why such an article was published. The article described a moment of tenderness between the princess and the general. The general returned home slowly, and the servants greeted him. Lapis did not want to show his mistress this article at all. He shouted that nothing had happened and he would like to eat the apple as soon as possible. The young lady was surprised, as she did not expect such behavior from a wizard. With lightning speed, he threw down the newspaper and shouted that he really wanted an apple today, before he came to her. The young lady looked at him in surprise and said that in that case he should have told the maid about it. Some time later he sat quietly in the chair and fidgeted as he looked at the young lady. Meanwhile, a sliced apple was already flaunting itself in front of him. The young wizard was puzzled, as he was suddenly eating apples that the lady had personally cut. He wanted to make sure to burn all the newspapers in the Dobb mansion as soon as she saw them. The young lady looked at the wizard intently and said that she heard that there was an article about the princess and her husband on the front page of today's newspaper. The young wizard decided, as he did not expect such a thing from her. He looked at her in surprise and timidly asked if she really knew. Alicia looked closely at the young man and asked with a smile if he wanted more apples. The butler looked at the gentleman intently and said that he was surprised when he returned late at night a few days ago, without any warning, and he also left at dawn. The butler said that he was very worried, since he did not even have a chance to rest properly. The general sighed heavily and said that nothing was expected to happen in the near future, and for this reason he would not be so busy. A moment later he looked closely at the office. He glanced sideways at the butler and said that he felt a strong discrepancy with what he had seen last time. The butler smiled and told his master that much had changed in the few months that he had been absent from the estate. The general looked at him closely and said that everything could be seen from afar, and it looked like they had done a general cleaning. The butler smiled and said that it was all thanks to the lady. He said that she had planned the placement of items in the house and organized the storage of expensive things, and also increased the efficiency of the servants by effectively distributing their time. He looked at the gentleman closely and said that she also increased people's desire to work by increasing rest time and many other things. He said with a satisfied smile that she did all this single-handedly. The general sighed heavily and, as he left, said that these were very significant changes. A moment later, the general was listening to the maid's conversation. The maid looked at her friend with a smile and said that the mistress should definitely know how much Mr. Lapis loved her. A moment later, they were taken aback and looked nervously at their master. But a few minutes later, a knight burst into their room. He shouted with a smile and asked the butler where the lady was now. He shouted that he had brought a lot of tasty things, but a moment later he wilted and froze in place when he saw the general's intense and angry gaze. A moment later, they were all standing quietly near the wall, looking at the general with puzzled expressions. The general looked at the young people with anger and confusion. He was surprised, since everyone was so eager to meet his wife, whom he had not even seen yet. He looked at the butler and called him. The butler in turn shuddered, not knowing what to answer. Looking at the gentleman, he said tremblingly that this was all because the lady was a very kind and caring person. The general asked if this was really the case. The butler smiled and said that the young lady had resolved the servants' difficulties and even dealt with the food problem that was greatly worrying the knights. The butler looked at the general intently and said that the young lady had also increased her productivity percentage. The young men in turn nodded and agreed with the butler. He frowned for a moment and wondered if it was only him she was so wary of. The general sighed heavily, as everything was very complicated. He looked intently at everyone present and said that he had to see his wife. He asked where she was now. The young wizard quietly ate an apple, but a moment later he asked the young lady if the content of the article upset her. Alicia, with an innocent smile, said that she didn't even know. She sighed heavily and said that she knew that the general and the princess were not on such a relationship. She smiled and looked at the wizard intently. She said that even if there was something between them, there was nothing she could do about it anyway. The young wizard looked intently at the young lady and shouted that he would teach the general a lesson in that case. The young lady was surprised, but at the same time happy. She laughed, looking at the young man. For some time, the general stood quietly behind the door and listened to their conversation. A moment later, the young lady was taken aback as she saw that her husband had arrived. She looked at him in surprise, as he stood quietly and stared at her. He looked at them with fury and said with a smirk that it seemed like he had disturbed their friendly and carefree time. He looked intently at the wizard and told him to go away and not bother the lady of this house anymore. The wizard sighed heavily and quietly said that the lady had never once said that he was boring her. The general glanced sideways at the young man as he noticed that he had a plate of apples. He told the wizard to leave the plate in the room. A moment later, the general was quietly and intently looking at the apples cut up on the plate. She looked at her husband in surprise, as she did not understand why he now looked as if he was in a bad mood. She was a little agitated and puzzled, as she could not understand him at all. The young lady slowly reached for the plate. He looked at her intently and asked why she didn't peel his apples for him. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he really wanted apples. The young lady said that in that case she would call the maid. A moment later, the general noticed a newspaper on the table that was crumpled. He began to read the newspaper. A moment later, he told his wife that she did not need to call anyone at all, as he wanted to eat something peeled by her hands, be it an apple or a peach. He looked at her intently and, with a sly smile, asked if she would feed him in bed. The young lady was shocked because he came home after a long time and the first thing he talks about is bed. He looked closely at his wife and said that he thought she had just bewitched him, but it turned out not to be so. He looked at her with a smile and said that it seemed like everyone in this house was in love with her. Alicia looked at her husband in surprise and excitement and asked when she had managed to bewitch someone. He kissed her hand tenderly and asked if she didn't remember it. He looked intently into her radiant eyes and said that she undressed on the very first day of their meeting and sneaked into his room in the middle of the night. Lucerne pulled his wife closer to him and said with a satisfied smile that she even managed to drag him down the aisle, and this despite the fact that he never intended to get married. The general tenderly touched her soft and elastic lips. He looked at her intently and said that she should look into his eyes. He smiled and said that she had a very good memory. A moment later, he kissed her tenderly and with all his passion. He looked at her closely and said with a smile that she should take off her clothes. Alicia was surprised. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he really wanted to do it right now. He smiled and said that he would like to look at her. She sighed heavily, as it seemed to her that he had had a good time with the princess in his imperial palace. She wondered if he had returned home and was trying to satisfy his needs with her. She understood perfectly well that she could do nothing about it, because she was his contract wife. The young lady looked intently at her husband and said that she did not want to undress alone. For a moment, the general froze in surprise. He did not expect to hear anything like this from his wife. But a moment later he undressed. He looked at his wife with a satisfied smile and asked if she was happy now. The young lady froze in place with embarrassment and was taken aback. She looked at the scar on his body, surprised and excited, and asked where he got it. The general looked closely at his wife and said that he got this scar in the temple. The general sighed heavily and calmly said that as a child he lived in the temple under the guidance of Uncle Merk. She looked at her husband with concern and asked if he had really lived there and received the wound there. He looked at her intently, but did not answer. A moment later, the general sat down on the bed and said that if an orphan living in such a place does a bad deed, he is punished, and at the same time, he is lashed with a whip. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he had really been a bad child. He sighed heavily and said that by their standards, that was exactly it. A moment later, he touched her hand tenderly and said that that was enough talking. He pulled his wife closer to him, and she screamed involuntarily. A few seconds later, she was already on the bed, and he was towering over her with a satisfied smirk on his face. He looked closely at his wife and said with a smile that he could no longer restrain himself, but her body was still weak. He sighed heavily and said that doing it slowly would not be easy. Alicia, in turn, froze in embarrassment. She was a little nervous because she felt strange, but at the same time good. She enjoyed his kisses and wondered if it was okay. She was confused because she knew she was just a pawn for him. Sometime later, as they lay quietly in bed, the young lady sighed heavily and realized that it was already night. She was a little surprised and puzzled as she realized that they had been doing this all day. The general tenderly embraced his wife and kissed her. He asked if she was awake yet. She sighed heavily and told her husband that she couldn't even move. He looked at her intently and with an innocent smile said that she still needed to get up and wash herself. He smiled and said that she should wear something nice. He looked at her intently and said that they should eat outside. Alicia looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand what he was talking about. Lucerne looked at his wife with a smile and said that they hadn't managed to do this last time. Alicia, in turn, looked at her husband in surprise, as she did not expect to hear such a thing from him. She looked around carefully as she realized that all eyes were directed at her husband. A moment later, she looked at him with an intent gaze. Alicia was well aware that her husband was very attractive, but she didn't know if that was the only reason. She sighed heavily, as she realized that it was most likely due to his bad reputation. A moment later, the young man slowly pushed back his chair and said with a smile that she could sit down. She looked at him in surprise, as she had not expected such polite manners, but thanked him nonetheless. He looked at his wife in surprise and asked if she was looking for something. The young lady was taken aback, as she did not expect such a question. She said that she was not looking for anything, it was just that the offer to have dinner came so unexpectedly, and she wondered if he wanted to introduce her to someone. She remembered the previous conversation between the princess and her husband. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. He said with a smile that he was currently having dinner with his wife. He asked if any introductions were needed now. Alicia was taken aback for a moment and froze in surprise, as she had not expected to hear such a thing at all. She looked away from him in embarrassment as he called her his wife. A moment later, a young man burst into the room. He was screaming and calling for help, but he was not in proper attire. He screamed in rage as a man dressed as a girl attacked him. With tears in his eyes, he asked everyone present for help. The young ladies looked at the man intently and puzzledly, as they knew that he had come out of the stairs that led to the hotel. They said that he looked as if his wife had caught him cheating on him. The young lady, in turn, froze and looked intently at the man. She realized that this was Carol's father, the Marquis. She was surprised because she did not understand why he was in such a state. The Marquis, in turn, with tears in his eyes, asked people to hide him. The man shouted at his client that he should not behave like this. The Marquis shouted in a rage that he was looking for him. Everyone looked at the Marquis in surprise and intently. The young lady, in turn, was surprised. She knew that the Marquis was known for his excellent relationship with his wife. She did not understand why everything happened this way. A moment later, the general, sipping his wine, said with a grin that it was a very interesting sight. Carol angrily struck the young lady, who fell to the ground with a crash. She said with a grin that not long ago her mother had asked a fortune teller for a prediction. She looked closely at the young lady and asked with a smirk if she knew what the fortune teller had said. With a smirk, she said that some sinister special thing had stuck to Jacob. Karis said that one young lady was stealing all her men. She looked closely at the young lady and asked who the girl was who was always hanging around him. The young lady frowned for a moment as she recalled her past life. She remembered how the Marquis had caught her and held her against her will. He looked at the girl with a grin and asked how she dared to reach out to his daughter's man. The Marquis looked at her with rage and said that because of her, his daughter was sad and crying bitterly. The lady sighed heavily as she remembered her past. She knew that she had gone through a lot because of them. She knew perfectly well that their entire family was filled with the unshakable conviction that she was eager to get Carol's man. She sighed heavily and sadly wondered why everything had happened this way. She knew that there had definitely been some kind of unpleasant situation, but it had to serve as a reason. The general looked closely at his wife and asked what she was thinking so deeply about. The young lady was taken aback and said that she had not thought about anything like that. She frowned for a moment, knowing that her memories felt incomplete after her return. She recalled most of the events, but something eluded her. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that she was still looking in that direction. He asked if she really felt sorry for the man. Alicia froze for a moment in surprise, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. A moment later, she sighed heavily and asked who the man was that she should feel sorry for. The general said that the man was a Marquis and that he was Carol's father. The young lady looked closely at her husband, wondering if he was probing her. She sighed heavily because she understood that this simply could not be, and she could not believe that the recent incident was the work of the Marquis's hands. She sighed heavily and said that, apparently, Carol took after her father. The general looked at the young lady with a smile. A moment later he asked his wife if she liked the food. She smiled and said that she liked everything. He smiled a satisfied smile and said that he was glad to hear it. Lucerne looked at his wife in surprise and asked where she could find a cook for the mansion. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment, as she had not expected such a question, but a moment later she said with a smile that she had first decided to make inquiries at the best inn in their area, and as a result it turned out that army cooks had previously been responsible for the cooking in their house. She sighed heavily and said that was why she had decided to recruit them again and put them under the command of the head chef. She sighed heavily and said that it did not contradict military regulations as long as they were all within the mansion grounds, so he should not worry. The general looked at her closely and said that he was not worried about it, but he was still very curious about how she came to such a decision. He asked if the archbishop had helped her. The young lady smiled and said that she never gave her ready-made answers. Alicia smiled and said that instead she was taught one method. Alicia said that if someone needs answers, then they need to choose the right people and the right place to ask their questions. Lucerne looked at her intently and asked how she was going to keep a trading book. He asked in surprise how she had decided on a supplier of products. Alicia said that she had learned how to keep a trading book in the monastery. She looked at her husband intently and said that she had simply renegotiated with the current suppliers. The general looked at his wife in surprise, but said nothing. A moment later he came closer to her. For a moment she froze in surprise, as she did not expect such a thing from him. He smiled and asked, since when she was so smart. He asked with a smirk if she had all this since birth. Alicia sighed heavily and said that, as a child, she had no money at all, because her father did not pay for her stay in the monastery. She said, puzzled, that in order for Togo to survive, she needed the means to subsist. She said that this is why every time she visited the nearest village, she carefully looked around the market, so she learned that branded goods were sold at a higher price than others. After which she immediately set about creating a trademark for the monastery, and even showed how best to promote alcohol. She heard that it was made by monks from Morning Dew. She sighed heavily and said that in this way the selling price had increased almost several times, and then she was taken on as an apprentice. The general looked at his wife with a smile and said that this was very surprising. He pulled his wife closer to him and said with a smile that he was very interested. He looked at her intently and with a satisfied smile asked whether he had taken possession of her or whether she had pulled him towards her. He looked closely at his wife and said that her story was getting more and more moving with every word she said. He smiled and asked if it was too suspicious. He smiled and said that she was already smart by the age of 14, and now it seemed to him that she had lived more than one life. The young lady in turn shuddered and looked at him intently. She did not answer. The lady looked away from her husband and asked if something was wrong. She sighed heavily and said that there were many people in the world who had already achieved a lot at 14. She looked at her husband closely and said that she would certainly be able to cope well with the role of his wife, and if she had the appropriate awards, she would try even harder. He looked at her closely and said that it sounded impressive. He said that he would definitely call the jeweler and she could buy whatever she wanted. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she did not need the jewelry at all, and besides, she had no plans to go out in public anytime soon. She thought for a moment, because she knew that after the divorce, the jewelry would certainly come in handy, but she knew perfectly well that now it was more important for her to make her husband the head of the family. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she hadn't mentioned a reward. The young lady said that she would prefer a trip to jewelry. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she really wanted to travel the world. Alicia looked intently at her husband and said that she didn't need that. The closest hot springs would be enough for her. The young lady said that if he was busy, she could go alone. The general looked closely at his wife and said that if we are talking about the nearest hot springs, then it is Ulif. He looked closely at her and, pulling her closer, said that they would go there together. She was surprised, since she did not expect to hear such a thing from him. The general looked at her intently and asked with a smile if she was happy about it. She gave him a lovely and sweet smile and said that she was very glad, as she really wanted to go there. A moment later, the general tenderly embraced his wife and kissed her on the top of her head. Some time later, the young people were discussing the general and his wife's honeymoon. They were surprised, as they knew that this was not at all like the gentleman. The young lady slowly handed the soldier a menu for them to take while she was away. She smiled and said that she had also written down the necessary ingredients and their approximate cost in a book. Lucerne sighed heavily and said that she had spent the whole night with the trading book. She had parted with it only just before the trip with him. He sighed heavily and asked what kind of wife behaved like that, She sighed heavily and said that it was natural, since they could not take care of the management of the mansion as soon as they left. A moment later, the young lady turned around as she heard someone calling her. She looked in surprise at the young wizards, who stood quietly and stared at her. She came closer to them and asked excitedly what had happened. The young man looked closely at the lady and said with a smile that he had heard that his brother Lapis had caused her a lot of inconvenience. The young lady looked closely at the young wizards as she realized that the young man was much older than his brother. He looked at his brother and said with a smile that, for this reason, they had prepared a small gift for her trip. She looked at them in surprise, as she did not expect such a thing. He looked at the young lady with a smile and said that they had not prepared anything special, but still wanted her to accept their gift. Alicia looked in surprise at the lovely bracelet and thanked them. The young wizard smiled and said that it was not just a bracelet, but a bracelet, and if there was dark magic or unclean energy nearby, a bell on it would immediately ring. The young lady looked at them in surprise and said with a smile that this was the first time she had received such a wonderful gift. She looked at them with a smile and said that she would definitely wear it and thanked them again. They looked closely at the young lady and wished her a good trip with a smile. The general quickly hugged his wife and asked with a grin if she was really saying now that she was receiving such a wonderful gift for the first time. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she said such words because she was very grateful to them. He looked at her intently and asked if it was true. He smiled and, looking at his wife, said that in that case he should entertain her properly on their trip so that she would never speak like that again. The young lady, in turn, looked at her husband in bewilderment. She did not understand why he was telling her such things. A moment later, they arrived at the resting place. She was surprised as she saw a beautiful room. The general looked at his wife intently and said that she could openly show her admiration, because this was the most luxurious hotel in the city, and this was the best place for a honeymoon. Alicia looked at him in surprise as he started talking about a honeymoon. Sometime later, a man came to them and greeted the general. He smiled and said that as a manager, it was a great honor for him to welcome them to the hotel. The man looked intently at the general and said that if it was not a burden for him, he could appear at their reception today. The general, in turn, did not let the man finish his prepared speech and immediately said coldly that it was a burden for him. The young lady looked closely at the man who was in the darkness. She smiled and said that they would definitely come, and also thanked him for the invitation. The man quickly bowed and thanked the lady. The general looked at her in surprise and asked why they should go there since he had no desire at all. She looked intently at her husband and said that attending a ball organized at such a resort would undoubtedly bring great benefits. Here one could establish connections with people who are difficult to meet in everyday life. He hugged his wife and quietly whispered in her ear that all he wanted was to spend all day in bed with her. She froze in place with embarrassment. The young lady sighed heavily, as this was exactly what she had feared. She knew perfectly well that she needed to take matters into her own hands. The young lady looked closely at her husband and said that there was not much time left before the reception, and they needed to start preparing now. The general looked at his wife in surprise but did not answer. He understood that he had no choice. Sometime later they were already at the organized banquet. She was surprised, as there were a lot of people. He sighed heavily and said that this was natural, because now is the beginning of the season. She looked away from him and timidly asked how he planned to introduce her to people. He looked at her sideways and said that, of course, he would introduce her as his wife. The general looked at her in bewilderment and asked if there were any other options. She started to speak, then hesitated and froze for a moment. She knew that most people hoped that the general would work out with the princess. He looked closely at his wife because he saw that she was very sad. He took her hand and said that he had met the princess in the palace only once, and that was on the day the article was published, and their joint portrait was just a figment of the artist's imagination. Alicia looked at her husband in surprise, as she did not expect to hear something like that from him. He sighed heavily and, looking at his wife, said that it seemed to him that something similar was worrying her. She sighed heavily and said that it wasn't so, but since he had told her everything, it must be so. He smiled and said that she was very short, and that was wonderful. She looked closely at everyone present as she felt their gazes on her. The young lady knew perfectly well that they were unlikely to say anything good about them. She knew perfectly well that they were most likely saying that the general had married a poor aristocrat just for the sake of status. She sighed heavily because she knew that it didn't matter and she couldn't lose heart. And for this evening, she had even prepared this outfit. A moment later, young people approached them and greeted the general with a smile, and congratulated him on his victory. The young man looked closely at Alicia and said that she looked like his wife. He smiled and said that she was beautiful, just as he had heard. She thanked them with a smile. She looked closely at the young people and said that they probably had something to talk about, and therefore she wanted to leave them. The young man looked at her with a smile and said that she and hers were a little to match her beauty. The general looked intently after his wife. She sighed heavily as she understood that the general was having no easier time at this reception than his wife. Some time later, young ladies approached her. She looked at them with a smile and greeted them. The young lady said with a smile that they were very pleased to meet her in such a place. They looked closely at Alicia and asked if she knew any news about the Marquis of Fulham. The lady said with a smile that she had heard what they said, that he had been caught in a very inappropriate state, and that the Marquise had even taken to her bed when she heard about it. The lady looked closely at Alicia and asked what she thought about it. The young lady, in turn, knew full well that the Cartiers were known for their bad relationships within the family, so these ladies seemed to think that she would say nasty things behind their backs. Alicia looked at them closely and said that unfortunately she was not very familiar with the goings-on in the high society. She looked closely at the young lady and asked if there were any interesting events planned here soon. The lady smiled and said that the temple festival was coming up soon. She smiled and said that at the last such festival a fragment of the prophet's bone was sold. She smiled and said that thanks to that small fragment, the price of their lands had increased incredibly. She knew that they were selling bones for profit and they didn't hide where the proceeds actually went. She wondered if this was truly noble. The young man looked at her intently and said with a grin that he was very glad to see her. She turned around and froze in place, as she did not expect to see him at all. The young man looked at the young lady with a grin. The young man looked at the general with surprise and a grin, as there was a beautiful young lady behind his shoulder. They whispered and said that the girl seduces and takes away a new man every night. They smiled and told the general that it seemed like he was her new target today. The young lady approached the general and grabbed his hand with a smile. She smiled and said that she had heard that he and his wife had been enjoying marital harmony lately. She smiled and said that the life of newlyweds was undoubtedly good, but she could teach him many interesting things. The general did not listen to the young lady and angrily pushed her away. She looked at him intently and said with a smirk that his wife was undoubtedly very beautiful, but she didn't even wear new dresses. The general looked at her sideways and asked what nonsense she was talking about. The young lady said that she had noticed earlier that the edge of her hem had been treated in a way that had become popular several years ago. She said with a smirk that if his wife had started mending an old outfit, she had to do it perfectly. She looked at the general intently and said with a grin, "Otherwise, his wife risks becoming the subject of gossip." He looked at her intently but said nothing. The young lady, in turn, stood at a distance and talked to a young man. He looked at her closely and said with a grin that he could not even imagine that the girl, who until recently was a servant, had now become a lady. He said with a grin that the world had improved a lot. She looked at him intently and said that she didn't even think he remembered her name. She sighed heavily and turned around. The young lady said that if he had nothing to say to her, she would leave him. The young man was surprised by such impudence and shouted at her to stay put. He grabbed her hand angrily and told her that she had better be obedient and follow him quietly. Alicia was taken aback for a moment, but said nothing. Alicia looked at him with fury and indignation and asked what he was allowing himself to do. He looked at her intently and said that he heard from his wife that she was absolutely glued to the general and was engaged in all sorts of perversions with him. He approached the young lady closer and said with a smirk that her husband would never become the head of the family. He smiled and asked why she didn't think about choosing the right side. Marco looked at her closely and said with a smirk that instead of being content with being the legal wife of a bastard, she would be better off becoming the mistress of the next head. The young lady was shocked and wondered if this man was seducing her. She was puzzled because she knew that even in his past life he had felt some strange desire for her. She looked at him with a smirk and asked if it was true. She came closer to him and asked with a smirk if he was the next chapter. He looked at her in surprise, as he did not expect this. She looked at him intently and with a satisfied grin asked if she could really ask him about this when she met the head. She said that she was very interested in whether Mr. Marco would really lead the family in the next generation. He looked at her with fury and asked if she was really mocking him now. Lucerne looked at them closely and said with a smile that his wife was not one to make fun of others. He looked closely at the young man and said that it was most likely he who had told her something interesting. The general looked intently at Marco and asked if he could repeat what he had just said to his wife. Marco tensed up, shaking with fear. He said he hadn't said anything. The general looked at the young man with a grin and said that it seemed that he had a very short memory. He came closer to him and angrily squeezed his face in his hand. A moment later, Marco fell to the ground with a crash. For a while, he sat quietly on the ground, But a few minutes later, he was already asking for salvation. The general looked at him intently with contempt in his eyes and told him not to overdo it, since he was not going to die after all. The general looked sideways at his wife and said that it was time for them to go. The young lady looked at her husband with concern and asked if everything would be okay. She was worried that this incident might reach the head of the family. The general asked with a smile what this guy would tell the duke. He said that he would not tell the duke that he was being bullied by a bastard using dark magic that was inaccessible to him. He looked at his wife and said that she didn't need to worry because he would never tell anyone about it. The young lady was taken aback for a moment. She didn't understand why everyone was looking at them so intently. The general smiled and hugged his wife tenderly. He said that it was all because they thought they were just crazy perverts. He smiled and said that they were gossiping about how they were ready to stick to each other anywhere. The general told his wife with a smile that while she was not around, several people had even approached him with immoral proposals. Lucerne said with a grin that they apparently thought that since he was not restrained in his sexual desires, it would be easy to agree. He looked closely at his wife and said that it turned out that one such bug had stuck to his wife too, and besides, she was the most disgusting of them. The young lady looked at her husband in surprise, as she did not understand what he was talking about. The general looked closely at his wife and asked, since it came to that, whether they should not justify everyone's expectations. He smiled and said that they would make sure that no midges would dare to come near them again. He kissed his wife tenderly. The general looked closely at his wife and asked if she was wearing new clothes. The young lady said that this was not the case, and she decided to alter the outfit that was in the mansion. He looked at her closely and said that he now understood why the clothing expenses seemed too low. He said that she should not do that anymore. The young lady looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. He asked if she had already done everything herself. The general said that no one would praise her for such a thing. He told her that instead of being frugal, she should use his money for its intended purpose and should raise her reputation. The young lady sighed heavily, as she thought that everything was sewn up well and nothing was visible. She really wanted to make her outfit in the style of her mother's dress. A moment later, she sighed heavily and agreed with her husband, and also said that she would go shopping tomorrow. He sighed heavily and said that she was very obedient. The lady was walking leisurely around the estate when she suddenly heard someone's voices. The duke sighed heavily and said that the young lady was very smart, and if it weren't for that scar on her face, she would have lived a peaceful life. She looked at them in surprise and wondered if they were talking about her now. The duke looked closely at his grandson and said that he would like to take care of her upbringing, but unfortunately, the young lady was very weak in spirit, and it seemed to him that she would have to return back to Jacob. The general looked closely at his grandfather and said that as soon as she got involved with their family, the path to a quiet life was closed for her. The duke looked at his grandson in surprise and asked if he was really the one who was trying to get the girl. The general smiled and said that he couldn't feel sorry for anyone and that it would be impolite in relation to the life he led. He smiled and said that he thought the girl was very beautiful in a green dress. The young lady thought for a moment, as she knew he gave the impression of being a man who was always playing with girls. She knew she never wore anything green. A moment later, she froze in place as a strong wind suddenly blew and she was covered in green leaves. Alicia looked at Nora intently and asked for forgiveness. Since the distinguished knight was assigned as a simple escort to the mistress who was going shopping, Nora in turn shouted that everything was fine and she had to protect her. She understood perfectly well that she could not miss the chance to win the lady's favor. She understood perfectly well that she needed to create memories with the young lady that would be no less than the others. She understood perfectly well that no matter what the lady bought, she would definitely say that it was beautiful. A moment later, the young lady noticed a brokerage agency and asked the knight if they could go in there for a while. Nora looked at the lady in surprise and asked if this wasn't the real estate agency she visited in the capital. The young lady said that yesterday at the reception, she heard that all the wives of the aristocrats here had villas or a hotel membership card. She looked closely at Nora and said that she also thought that in order to carry on a conversation with them, she would need to study. Nora looked at her mistress, as she understood that an aristocrat also needed to learn a lot. She sighed heavily as she realized that their mistress was having a hard time. A moment later, Nora opened the door and let her mistress inside. Alicia thanked her with a smile. A moment later, they froze at the door as they heard a terrible scream. The young lady, in turn, screamed furiously that she needed this land. She looked intently at the young man and said that when it came to the auction, he should be her representative at the auction. The young man was taken aback. He said that, unfortunately, representation at auctions is illegal. The young lady shouted in a dull voice that she knew this very well, and that she also knew that he was an expert in this field. She looked at him intently and with a satisfied smirk said that he should use whatever he wanted, but they had to make sure that her name was not revealed. Arian looked at him intently and said that he had to do it. Alicia, in turn, sighed heavily and told her knight that they had just seen Marco's wife. They looked around the corner of the house with lightning speed and hid. Nora looked at her mistress in surprise as she did not understand why they were hiding. Alicia, in turn, glanced sideways at the lady she had found, who was quickly leaving the agency. The young lady looked at the knight and said that she had a favor to ask of her. Alicia handed her some gold and told her to find out what kind of land the young lady wanted to get. Alicia looked at Nora and said that according to rumors, Carol and Arian are not so simple, and as it seems at first glance, the young lady said that now she is kind of an advisor to her husband, so she thinks that she should give him useful information. Nora looked closely at the young lady, because she knew that she was already doing enough. Now she understood perfectly well what her mistress was so worried about. She looked intently at her mistress and said with a smile that she would try to find out everything. The young lady looked sharply at the coachman and said that they would be back soon, so he could wait for them by the carriage. He looked closely at the young lady and said that he would wait for her without any problem, but he was surprised and did not understand what kind of business a noble lady could have on the endless plains. She looked at the young man intently with a smile on her face, but did not answer him. The young lady was surprised as she could now see the land that Arian was aiming at. Nora sighed heavily and said that she didn't think there was anything valuable here at all. Nora looked closely at the ground and sighed heavily, saying that everything here was very strange. She was surprised because there was no grass growing in this place. The young lady thought for a moment and looked closer. A moment later, she was taken aback and screamed, as her bracelet with a bell began to jingle very loudly. The young lady screamed involuntarily. Nora looked at the lady in surprise and excitement and called her as she did not understand what was happening. A moment later, the young lady's bracelet broke and the bell itself shattered into pieces. The young lady looked with fear at the bracelet that was lying on the ground. She sighed heavily and said that it was broken. She felt offended, since she received it as a gift from the young wizards. She slowly picked up several pieces of the bracelet and said that the wizards told her that this bracelet reacts to evil energy. Nora looked around in surprise and said that there were no signs of monsters here. Alicia looked at the knight in surprise and asked if the thing the wizard had made was really working incorrectly. Nora looked at the lady intently and said that this simply couldn't be true. Things that were made by wizards had never broken before. She sighed heavily as she was a little worried. She didn't understand what the matter was then, if not the monsters. She wondered if it was just a coincidence. She thought for a moment, since the strange thing happened exactly in the territory that Arian wanted to get. She looked closely at her protector and said that if she knew much more about this place, she would dig to the very end. The young lady looked into the distance, a little puzzled and excited, and wanted to find out as much as possible about this area. Nora looked intently at the gentleman and said that this could be considered the end of his report to the lady about the day. The general looked at the knight intently. He said that he would like to hear more about the suspicious land and the young lady. Nora sighed heavily and said that after she had escorted her mistress to the carriage, she had looked everything over again thoroughly, but there was nothing special there. Nora said excitedly that the lady seemed to have slightly injured her wrist when the bracelet broke. She sighed heavily and said that it was entirely her fault since she was unable to protect the lady. Nora looked at the gentleman intently and said that for this reason she would gladly accept his punishment. The general looked at the knight with a smile and said that it seemed that his wife had discovered something interesting, and it turned out that shopping alone was not enough for her. The knight looked at the general in surprise and called him. The general slowly walked up to the shelf where the books were. He took one book and walked up to the knight and asked where the land in question was located. He looked at her closely and said that she should tell him the exact location. A moment later, the hole revealed the area in which the land was located. The general quickly threw the book to his knight and told him to get everything ready. Ian looked at his master in surprise and asked where he was going. The general said with a smile that his wife had prepared a gift for him, and now he had to check it. The young lady looked closely at her husband and said with a smile that thanks to stupid Marco, they were now the only ones left in the game. She smiled and said that she was very glad that they did not give up and continued to work on this issue. The man thought for a moment about the land that Arian wanted to buy. He was a little worried since no one knew about the existence of such a secret. He smiled and said that it was very good that they took him without any problems. The young lady in turn looked at them intently. She heard what they were talking about. Alicia woke up and saw her husband sitting quietly next to her. She looked at him in surprise and asked why he was not sleeping at such a late hour. He sighed heavily and asked if she should not have asked him where he was at such a late hour. The general looked sideways at his wife and said that she was hurt. She sighed heavily and said that it was just a scratch, but it still hurt a little. He looked at her intently, but said nothing. A moment later, he came closer to her and said that she should get up. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment, as she did not understand what he was talking about. He looked at her intently and with a beaming smile, said that he wanted to show her what he had found. Sometime later, they arrived at the place. The young lady looked around in surprise and said that this was not like the place they were yesterday. He smiled and said that his shadow had found something underground, and for that reason he used his magic. The general said that if a wave appeared in the manna, it meant that there was an evil spirit or a magic stone nearby. Ian looked at them intently and said that there was a wave, but as Nora reported, there was no demon nearby. The general smiled and told his wife that instead he had found something. He smiled and said that they had found a secret device that had been hidden. Ian looked at the gentleman and said that perhaps the lady should stop there. Lucerne insisted that the young lady be shown everything. He looked at his wife with a satisfied smile and said that he was sure she wanted to see it. The young lady, in turn, looked at her husband in bewilderment, as she did not understand what he was talking about. The knight looked closely at the door and slowly began to open it. He said that there was something hidden in the ground. The young lady, in turn, froze in shock when she saw the terrible picture. She was shocked because she saw a dead man in front of her. The Duke said that he was a prophet who died many years ago. He looked closely at his wife and said that he personally checked the unique blue tattoo that lights up on saints and prophets. He sighed heavily and said that it was definitely him. The young lady was shocked as she now realized that the bone fragments that were supposedly being sold in the temple belonged to the wrong person. He smiled and said that Marco would monopolize the remains of the temple with the help of his father. He looked closely at his wife and said with a satisfied smile that, if you think about it, this body could destroy his uncle and his son. The young lady was shocked because she now understood what Jacob and his wife had found back then. She knew there was some secret in the ground, but she didn't think there would be something like this. The knight sighed heavily and said that around the body were full of bonds, bank books, treasures, and first-class mana stones with his name on them. He sighed heavily and said that it seemed to be the secret Ristalpo safe. The young lady was surprised. She looked closely at the corpse and asked if this meant that he had committed suicide in his own crypt. He looked closely at his wife and said that this was not so, since there was a stab wound in the stomach and he was killed. He looked closely at his wife and said that, unfortunately, there were many mysteries here. But one thing was certain. The general looked at her closely and said with a satisfied smile that she was the one who found this place. She sighed heavily and said that she was just lucky, and in any case, he had information that could cause Marco a mortal wound. He looked at his wife closely and with a contented smile said that he was very grateful to her, and now he had more thoughts. He smiled and said that the nicest thing he ever learned was always a trap. He looked at his wife closely and said that they should go back first because it would be very bad if his wife caught a cold. He looked at his wife closely and said that he would leave some of the shade here just in case anyone found the place. He looked closely at his wife and, hugging her tenderly, said that they needed to talk about the details for now. As she left, the young lady glanced sideways at the place. She knew that in her past life, Carol had taken the land that Arian had tried to seize. She knew that the young lady was not doing this for any particular reason. She was doing it because it was mean. Alicia knew that a few years later they tried to build a villa on this land, but the wizard who accompanied her at that time knew the secret of this land. Unfortunately, from that moment on, Marco's power began to crumble. The prophet was of low birth and had to support most of his family. For this reason, he was very greedy for money. But, unfortunately, he reneged on his promise to donate his body under ridiculous conditions. His ashes in the temple would have prevented him from doing business. Merhi, unable to accept the rejection of the seer by the lower people, together with Marco tried to kill Ristalpo, the young man. But he escaped and managed to hide in his secret safe. She thought that, most likely, he died there, because he was mortally wounded. The young lady sighed heavily as she now felt that another piece of the puzzle had found its place. He looked closely at his wife and said that the owner of the land was the young man's secretary. He was also his brother and looked very similar to him in face, and he also went missing many years ago. The young lady looked at her husband in surprise and said that it seemed that he had also become a victim along with his brother, and unfortunately his body could not be found. Lucerne sighed heavily and said that this was exactly the case, and the land would soon be auctioned off because taxes had been predicted for many years. He looked closely at his wife and said that the young lady probably had no idea that the body of a young man was lying in the ground, and if he had known, he would not have calmly waited for the auction, but would have immediately bought the land from someone. Alicia sighed heavily and said that everything was clear to her now, and if they had not found the body of the young man who looked like him, he would not have been interested in the land. She looked at him intently and said that they didn't need the land at all. She asked why they didn't just steal the body. He looked at her worriedly and said that was simply impossible. He looked closely at his wife and asked her why she thought the body of the prophet who died many years ago was still untouched. She hesitated, not knowing what to answer. He said that it was all because of a rare time barrier that was created when mana and divine power collided. Thus the mana stone and the power of the body in the vault protect the body. He sighed heavily and said that if they tried to pull the body out of the ground, it would melt. He looked at his wife and said that she probably didn't see it, but the lower part of the body was almost melted. He sighed heavily and said that not only he, but no one else would be able to pull the body out of the ground. The young lady looked at her husband intently and said that this meant that whoever bought the land first would get the weak spot, Marco. The young man looked intently at his wife with a radiant smile. He was very glad that she understood everything quickly. The knight looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that they had already arrived at the hotel. Alicia thanked him for helping her down. He looked closely at his master and asked what they should do with all this. The general sighed heavily and said that he would give them instructions soon, so they should wait for now. He looked intently at his wife and said that before that they needed to have a family talk. She looked at him in surprise, but said nothing. He looked closely at the young lady and asked until what point she knew. She sighed heavily and said that she only knew that the young lady was hunting for some piece of land. She said that Jacob and Carol knew about it too. He looked at her closely and said with a smirk that he was sure she had gotten this information by looking into Jacob's office again. She sighed heavily and said that it was all true, but unfortunately she didn't know the details. Alicia said that they wanted to get the land, and she just thought that it might be some kind of conspiracy. He sighed heavily and said that everything she said was quite plausible. The general looked at his wife closely and said with a smile that it was not perfect and it was not enough to sort things out. He looked at her closely and asked if he should just move on because there was a beautiful girl in front of him. She looked at her husband and said that she had simply followed the young lady and he had found everything else. He slowly touched her face and said that he had guessed so. He looked into her beautiful eyes and said that she had met Marco at the ball yesterday. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he really suspected that she was having an affair with a young man. Lucerne sighed heavily and said that he didn't know and maybe it was him. The young lady grabbed his hand and looked him intently in the eyes. He sighed heavily and said that it was probably just a deep connection. Alicia sighed heavily and looked closely at her husband, as she understood that she was still very suspicious to him. She understood that she had to let him know that she was on his side. She sighed heavily and said sadly that she really wanted him to become the head of the family. She said that Jacob or Marco would not leave her alone if they came to power. She said that the royal family would protect him, but unfortunately no one would stand up for her. She looked at him closely and said that she really thought he was better than the Duke's other grandsons, and at least he was the general who saved the whole country. She looked at him intently and said in all seriousness that there was nothing strange in believing in a good man. She smiled and said that she really wanted to follow him, and she was now telling him this frankly. The young man sighed heavily and looked intently at his wife. He said with a sweet smile that he had nothing to say to such a sweet person as she. He smiled and said that she was his wife. Lucerne looked at her closely and said that he could handle any suspicions. He looked intently into his wife's eyes and asked what he had sentenced her to. She froze for a moment in surprise, as she had not expected such closeness. She looked at him intently and said that according to the terms of their contract, she had to make him the head of the family. Then he would free her. He smiled and said that it was very realistic. She came closer to him and said that if that was not enough, she would be forever devoted. Alicia looked at him intently and said that in the future she would never be so devoted to another man as the general. She looked at him intently and said that he should never set her up with a guy like Marco. She looked at her husband intently and said that the very thought of it made her sick. He looked at her intently with his beautiful eyes and said that he knew about it. A moment later, he pulled her hand and said that she should come closer to him. He looked closely at his wife and with a satisfied grin asked if she would like a kiss as a sign of reconciliation. The young lady was taken aback and asked him to wait a little. She froze in surprise, as she did not understand what was going on and why he was behaving this way. Sometime later she opened her eyes and noticed that it was already noon. The general looked intently at his wife and, hugging her with a tender smile, asked what his smart wife would do next. She sighed heavily and said that first of all they had to make sure that Marco's wife didn't find out the truth about the land. She said that they shouldn't guess why it was so important to get this plot of land. He looked closely at his wife and, hugging her with tenderness and warmth, asked how they would do this. She sighed heavily and said that the easiest and fastest way was to provoke Marco. A moment later, she was taken aback and screamed, not understanding what was happening. He looked at her intently and asked with a smile if she was really going to use her beauty for a young man. The general asked his wife if she hadn't come to her senses yet. She looked at him with confusion and said that he was thinking correctly and they should seduce. She looked intently at her husband and said that it was not she who should do this, but he and Arian. The general froze in shock and surprise. She looked at him intently and said that everything was correct and that he was the one who should do it, sighed heavily and said that before that she would like to hear the details. Alicia looked at Lucerne and asked in all seriousness what the relationship was between him, Murhi, and Marco. She looked closely at her husband, as she knew perfectly well that they were enemies, but she still knew that she needed to be aware of every little detail in order to choose the right side. The general sighed heavily and said that this was exactly the story she was expecting. He said that when he was a child, Murray's uncle beat him in the temple. He said that Marco was a boy priest at the time and he never touched him. Studying, archery, and memorizing the Bible, Lucerne was the best at it. Every time he succeeded, his uncle would put pressure on Marco, and Marco, in turn, would start a fight with him and get hurt. The young lady, in turn, thought with a sweet smile that if the young man had grown up comparing himself to her husband, then Marco's weakness must lie in his inferiority complex. The general looked closely at his wife and said that the young man had never been his rival, but unfortunately, only once had something truly terrible happened. One day his uncle scolded him harshly and Marco poisoned his food. This poison was not enough to kill him, but he was blinded for several days. The general sighed heavily and said that he was very afraid that he would go blind for the rest of his life, so he held on to the servants and prayed, but unfortunately, no one helped him. The young lady was taken aback and looked at her husband in surprise. She timidly asked what he had prayed for. He sighed heavily and said that he didn't know, since he no longer remembered anything. He remembers praying that his eyes could not see and begging for help. The young lady froze in place for a moment. She thought for a moment, and memories from her past life flashed before her. She ran as fast as she could. She heard how men shouted at her as she ran away. She was in shock and knew that she couldn't die like that. Moments later, she bumped into someone and begged for salvation. The young lady screamed that she couldn't see anything and asked the person to help her. The young man looked at the young lady in surprise. He did not understand what was in front of him. He froze when he saw the beautiful young lady in front of him. Unfortunately, she was in a sorry state. The young lady was shaking with fear. She was crying and telling the young man that she didn't know anything and just had to give Carol's letter. The young lady looked at Alicia with fury. She was furious and did not understand how Carol knew the secret of the land. She screamed at Alicia that she would cut off her hands, tie them to a string, and say that this is how it all happened. She looked at the girl with a smirk and said that if she wanted to return alive, she should try to escape. The young lady, in her turn trembling with fear, asked the young man to pretend that he did not see her. She said that she would never forget his kindness. She begged him about it. Moments later, he untied her hands and placed several gold coins in her dress. He said that she should not be seen by him again. The young lady, in turn, froze for a moment in place as she heard his voice somewhere. She turned around and looked in the direction where the young man had just been, but unfortunately, there was no one there anymore. A moment later, she noticed that she had a coin in her dress. She took it out and was surprised because it was a gold coin and not a wooden one. She was shocked. She did not understand what he paid her for. A moment later, she was taken aback as she saw a young wizard. He was shouting that he had come to avenge the knights of the temple. He was shouting and saying that they must leave immediately. The young lady froze in shock as she saw the Black Lion Knights. She was taken aback and looked closely after them because she realized that if the Knights of the Black Lion were here, then that person was the general. She sighed heavily as she now understood the true reason why he had helped her in her past life. He looked closely at his wife and said that he shared with her because he wanted to hear her story too. He asked his wife what she was thinking. She sighed heavily and said that she was just thinking and remembered something. The general looked at his wife in bewilderment as he did not understand what she was thinking. She smiled and said that she now remembered how he paid Marco her debt. A few days later, they were already getting ready for an event. The general looked closely at his wife and asked if she was ready. He asked what about their enemy. The young lady sighed heavily and said that Marco's family would be present at today's ball. He looked at her in surprise and asked if these were all her preparations for the evening. The young lady looked at her husband in surprise and asked if anything else was required. He looked at her intently and said that the ladies he knew wore jewelry with precious stones on their necks and hands. The young lady thought for a moment and said that she was going to wear the bracelet the wizard gave her, but unfortunately it broke. She was a little nervous and did not understand why she needed jewelry around her neck. The young lady understood perfectly well that in any case she had a tattoo and did not see the point in her wearing any jewelry. He looked intently at his wife, but did not answer her. A moment later, the knight informed them that a jeweler had arrived. The general looked closely at the knight and told him to tell the jeweler that he could come in. Alicia looked at her husband in surprise and asked if he had really called the jeweler. The man looked at them with a smile and said that they should not rush and should take a closer look as he had brought the most luxurious goods from their store. The general told the man to show them the most expensive things. He said that his wife needed shock therapy. A moment later, the man smiled and showed them an exquisite bracelet. He smiled and said that the price of this piece of jewelry was the highest at last year's jewelry auction. He smiled and said that the advantage of it was that it fits perfectly on the lady's wrist and they can adjust the size with a screw mechanism. She thought for a moment and said that it would be difficult to take it off alone. He smiled and said that her husband would certainly help her with this. The man said with a smile that this bracelet is proof of pure love. The general looked at his wife and asked if she liked it. She looked closely at the item and said that it was iridescent and fit the wrist perfectly, but unfortunately it looked like a handcuff. The general looked at the bracelet with a smile and said that he liked it very much and that they were buying it. The man thanked the general with a smile for the good purchase. The general told the young man to leave the rest in the room and his man outside would write him a check. The young lady was surprised as she did not expect such a thing from her husband. He looked at her intently and pulled her towards him. The general told his wife with a smile that now, when she wanted to accept jewelry from another man, she would not miss him with the same tenderness. The young lady sighed heavily, and looking at her husband, said that the wizard was still a child. He sighed heavily and said that, unfortunately, a man is a man, and now in front of her was her husband, who was upset. A moment later, he hugged his wife tightly and used his magic on her. The young lady looked at her husband in surprise and asked what had happened. He said with a smile that he had hidden her tattoo in his shadow. He said that it had not disappeared, it had simply disappeared from prying eyes. She looked at him in surprise and asked why he did that. He smiled and said that he would have done it earlier if she had asked. She sighed heavily and said that she didn't know that the day would come when she would be able to hide it. He smiled and said that it would turn out that she liked it more than jewelry. The general said with a smile that he understood her perfectly. Alicia looked closely at her husband and thanked him with a satisfied smile. A moment later, she said that she was also grateful to him for the jewelry. The general looked at his wife intently and said that the ball was about to begin and he would listen to her strategy, but there was one condition. She looked at him in surprise and asked what condition he was talking about. He looked at her intently and said in all seriousness that she was not allowed to be nice to Marco. She sighed heavily and looked at him with a smile, because she understood that he was back to his old ways. Alicia looked at him in surprise and asked if he didn't trust her completely. Why was he following her plans? The young lady was taken aback as he pulled her hand. He pulled her closer to him with a smile and said that even if this was a trap, she would fall into his hands again and she would have nothing to lose. He smiled and said that this was a completely different matter. Lucerne looked closely at his wife and asked with a smile if they could go now. She smiled and looked at him tenderly. Some time later, the young people entered the banquet hall. Everyone looked closely at the young lady. They said that the general's wife looked good. They noticed that she had expensive jewelry. The young lady knew perfectly well that they were talking about her now. Alicia knew perfectly well that they were discussing her jewelry, for which she had given a fortune. She knew that they were talking about the fact that she did not need to worry about finances at all. The young lady looked at her husband intently and said that their goal today was to anger Marco and Arian. She looked at him intently and asked if he remembered this. The general sighed heavily and said that he remembered everything. Alicia said she heard that the young lady had a very high self-esteem and she couldn't stand being compared to anyone. With lightning speed, the young lady pulled the general towards her and asked why he didn't try it. She quickly whispered her sweet plan in his ear. He looked at his wife in surprise and asked if he should go that far. She sighed heavily and said that she personally didn't like her at all. He looked intently at his wife, but did not answer. A moment later, he sighed heavily and finally agreed with her. He smiled a sly smile and said that if his wife wanted it that way, then he should do whatever she wanted. The young lady thought for a moment. Unfortunately, her eyes were still burning with tears. She was puzzled because she understood that living one life twice is not so simple. She could not at all believe that all the ladies were looking at her so intently. A moment later, she was taken aback as she heard someone calling her. The young man came closer to her and said with a grin that it looked like she was a naughty girl in front of him. He said with a grin that it looked like she had come for the evening again. Mocking her, he said that of course he didn't understand what event she had come for. She looked at him closely and asked with a smile if he was okay. Alicia smiled and said that she thought he was in a lot of pain last time. He looked at her with fury and anger and asked what she was talking about. Moments later, he became furious and shouted angrily that she was just an arrogant bitch. Alicia looked at him intently and said with a smile that his proposal made her husband quite jealous of her. She looked closely at the young man and asked with a smirk on her face if he would remember what they had talked about last time. The young man was taken aback. He looked at her trembling and, unfortunately, could not utter a word. Alicia looked closely at the young man and said with a smile that she was worried about this. She said with a smirk that, as he already knew, her husband usually takes revenge in the same way in which he was offended. She looked intently at the young man and asked, with a grin, if he saw her husband and his wife at the end of the hall. He glanced sideways and noticed them. The lady, in turn, asked with a grin what they were talking about now. The young ladies stood and quietly discussed something, away from everyone. But of course, they were interested in the question of why the general's wife was not visible at the party today. The young lady said with a smile that she had heard that they looked stunning together. Her friend smiled and asked if it was true. She said that compared to the other men of the Cartier family, the general looked simply stunning. A moment later, she was taken aback, as she realized that she had made a grave mistake. The young lady, in turn, looked at them with fury, but a moment later she was taken aback as she heard someone calling her. The general, with a radiant smile, approached the young lady and called her. She was taken aback and looked at him in surprise. He smiled and said that they had not seen each other for a long time. The young ladies were shocked. They did not expect the general to greet their friend at all. They heard that their family did not have very good relationships. The young lady looked at the general with a long, smiling look and said that since he had married, he had become more often seen at such banquets. He came closer to her and said with a smile that it was not because of marriage. He looked at her closely and with a sly smile said that he thought she needed help. He smiled and asked if there was anything he could do to help her. The young lady was taken aback and looked at the general with embarrassment. She thanked him for his concern but said that she did not need any help. He came closer to her and said gloomily that this was not so. He said that he heard that she needed land. Lucerne said with a grin that he even heard that she had recently made herself known at a real estate agency. The young lady in turn was taken aback, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. She looked at him in surprise and asked how he knew about it. He looked at her with a smirk and said that she should not let what she wanted fall into the wrong hands. He said that this was the foundation of their family. The general looked at her intently and said that, unfortunately, there was still a lot to learn. Lucerne said that her husband was flirting with his wife. He looked at her closely and said that he thought he could touch Marco's jewel. He said with a grin that she had a cute face. He looked at her closely and said that he would rather have land than her. Alicia approached her husband and asked him with a warm smile if he had a good time. The general, in turn, looked at the young lady with a grin and said that this was not the case, because she was very boring compared to his wife. The young man ran up the stairs to his wife with lightning speed. He called her very loudly. He quickly came down to them and stood between them. He shouted at the general and insulted him. He looked at the general with anger and asked how he dared to mock his wife. The general looked at the young man intently and said that he had angered him first and now he was just trying to get revenge on him. Lucerne looked at the young man with fury and asked how he dared to flirt with his wife. He looked closely at the young men and said that they seemed to have heard that he wanted to build a new villa on the land of Europe. He smiled and, looking at the young people, said that he would get this land, and he really wanted to build a country house for his wife. The young lady looked at the general with a smile and asked if he would buy the land in her name. She smiled and asked if this was the same land that the general had promised to buy for his wife. She said with a satisfied grin that she really needed this land. The general hugged his wife with a satisfied smile and said that, of course, he would do everything as she wanted. He looked closely at the young people and said that they would see each other soon at the auction. The young people were shocked, as they did not expect such a thing. Sometime later, everyone was talking about how there had been a fight between the Duke's grandchildren over a vacant lot. They said that the general wanted to build a villa for his wife. The young people, in turn, discussed the fact that the price of land was sky high. They knew that the owner had disappeared without a trace and that the tax wouldn't amount to a penny. The young lady, in turn, discussed this land. They said that there might be hot springs there or there might not be. They said that the young people were competing with each other, but they were surprised that this time the general intervened. The young lady sat quietly drinking tea. She listened to all the conversations. She sat with a grin and listened to everyone, as she had already come up with a cunning plan. Sometime later, the young man received a slap in the face. The man was shouting angrily at Marco. He was very upset with him because he couldn't even do what he was told to do. The man was shouting angrily at the young man and said that he was simply told to buy the land. The man angrily asked the young man what he was thinking, since everything had not gone according to plan and they could not allow the young ladies to also be present at the auction. Marco shouted that he had acted as confidentially as possible. He shouted that he was caught because of his wife. The man sighed heavily and said that the young man's body had disappeared, and unfortunately they still hadn't found it. Marco screamed that this simply couldn't be, and that he was definitely dead. He screamed that he himself had personally stabbed the young man and that he had died. Marco looked at the man intently and asked if he believed in the existence of ghosts, but a moment later he stopped and froze. The man looked at him with fury and shouted that he must do everything they had planned right at the auction. He shouted that the election of the great patriarch would soon take place. He shouted that his future was guaranteed only when he became the patriarch. Marco sighed heavily and told his father that he knew perfectly well about it. The man sighed heavily. He knew that it had been very difficult for him to raise him in the temple. Now he thought that he still had to give it up. He knew that even when the young man was starved, beaten, and punished, he did not behave unbearably. He understood that if the Duke had not taken him, he would have definitely ended up at the World Temple, and this made him hate the little boy even more. He was furious, as he realized that the Duke had sided with Stefan and Mikolan. He was furious and knew he couldn't let him win easily. The young lady looked away in surprise as she heard someone calling her. The Empress looked at the young lady closely and greeted her with a smile. She smiled and asked the young lady if she would mind having a cup of tea with her. Alicia looked closely at the Empress and agreed with a smile. The Empress said with a smile that she had heard that you, young lady, had been visiting the cafe frequently lately. Alicia said that her husband did not want her to go alone because it was not safe, but he was not at all against this cafe. Alicia smiled and said that she liked to watch people on the street, and also from the cafe windows one could see how the whole capital worked. The Empress looked at her closely and realized that the girl was smarter than she thought. She also saw Nora, who was accompanying the young lady. She knew that Nora was one of the strongest knights of Lucerne. She thought that most likely the general really liked his wife. The Empress looked at the young lady intently and asked if she could speak to her informally. Alicia agreed with her. The Empress looked at her closely and said with a smile that the young lady could call her by her first name. Alicia was taken aback, and with an innocent smile the Empress said that she was much higher in status than her. She smiled, as she realized that these were just formalities. She looked at the young lady and said that she heard that she was participating in the open auction. She looked at her closely and asked if she was going to let him through. The Empress said that the Cartiers were quite scary. There was a possibility of losing some privileges. The young lady, in turn, smiled softly, but said nothing. A moment later, she looked at the Empress intently and said that she must be worried that she might have a bad influence on the general. The Empress froze in surprise. She sighed heavily and said that she knew there were rumors about her. The young lady looked at the Empress intently and said that the general usually did not get into fights with his brothers, and it was no coincidence that this happened now. The Empress sighed heavily, as she felt that the young lady did not look like a madwoman who wanted to dumb him down. The Empress looked closely at the lady and asked if it would not be better to leave him. The young lady sighed heavily and with a soft smile told the Empress not to worry. She said that the general would not be held back by a woman at all. She looked at the Empress intently and said that she was not the kind of person who would make her husband run around like a dog. The Empress frowned, for of course she did not like the young lady, but she did not at all want her friend to fall in the eyes of others. She sighed heavily, as she understood that she could not do anything. She looked closely at the young lady and said that she would help her. Alicia looked at the Empress in surprise, as she did not understand what she was talking about. The Empress smiled and said that there were many kinds of aristocratic fights. She said that one of them was how she looked before the light. She smiled and said that for this reason she needed to go to the auction in an impeccable outfit. The Empress said that she would definitely introduce the young lady to her designer. Alicia sighed heavily and thought about it, since she had not thought about it at all. She knew that she would need to find out what they were going to wear. She looked at the lady she had found in surprise and asked how she was going to find out. She said that women were very difficult to fight. Alicia looked at her closely and said with a smile that she didn't think it would be that difficult at all. The Empress looked at her with a smile and wished her good luck. The young lady also thanked her and wished her good luck. She looked at her maid intently and asked if she could ask her to do one errand. The maid smiled and said that she would do anything for her.